Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Order of the Broken Dragon in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, and another begins. The dream of fighting Darkspawn suddenly shifted around him, and Loghain found himself standing in the vigil. He turned, slowly, as a voice called out his name. Jarath, he said. Sorry, the elf said. I imagine this is a little disorienting. I'm dreaming. Actually, you are in the Fade. Sort of. It's like a waking dream, in some ways. I see, Loghain replied. Burhan questioned me this morning. It seems you were seen at the Ferelden Circle sometime after I had arrived here. I thought it best to be seen somewhere after we separated, Jarath replied. I found Morrigan. And my son. She named him Kieran. Loghain nodded. A good name. Is he? He's a perfectly normal boy, Jarath said. Well, no, he's my son, but you know what I mean. Loghain couldn't help but smile. I do indeed. How is Orlais? Warden Commander Claril isn't quite sure what to do with me. She definitely carries a grudge, but does subscribe to the notion that once a warden becomes a warden, their past is, somewhat forgiven. Mostly, she's simply been ignoring me. I have found some interesting tidbits in the library. Oh. There are a few scattered references to talking Darkspawn. One apparently once aided some dwarves trapped in a cave-in. I've been attempting to locate more complete references, but it's going a bit slow. He shrugged. Claril is sending me out to look into a report of Darkspawn south of Valfermin. That will unfortunately take me away from the keep for some time. A map slowly took shape on the wall. Where? Loghain indicated the location he'd been given. Jarath nodded. I'll meet you there, you can give me a full report of what you've found then. Nathaniel felt the call, and stepped into the Fade. His commander was waiting. News. A lead in Riven. Is Temerin still with you? He is. Jarath gestured at the map that hung on one wall. I'll meet you here. I need you to collect Carver Hawk. He's with Stroud, somewhere around here. He pointed at various spots on the map. Why Carver? He's using Templar abilities. Jarath sighed. Without lyrium. So, Nathaniel chuckled. Oops. He nodded. Oops. He's a good man. I agree. I think we can trust him with this. Loghain stopped briefly at the market. It took him several minutes to find what he was looking for, but eventually he tucked his prize into his satchel before continuing his journey south. He knew he was being sent by himself more as a potential suicide mission than anything else, but found he was rather enjoying the solitude after the last couple months of having everyone glaring at him. He was surprised at how much he missed the vigil. He was setting up camp a few miles from his destination when something pinged lightly on his senses. He put a hand to his sword, and then a familiar voice said, "It's just me." He turned to find Jarath approaching. "Commander," Loghain said by way of greeting. "Not my rank anymore," Jarath said. "There were Darkspawn at the site." "There aren't any more, and it's been sealed up nice and tight." "When are you expected back?" "I'm not sure I am," Loghain admitted. "But probably not for at least a couple weeks." "Follow me," Jarath said, and lead Loghain away from the road. They had walked for nearly half an hour before Jarath stopped at a rocky outcropping. "All right, this part gets a bit weird," he said, and then he stuck his hand through the rock. Loghain's eyes widened. "How?" "It's a doorway, of sorts. I left it open." "Go, I have to close it behind us." Loghain nodded, then braced himself and stepped through the rock. He found himself on a strangely lit pathway. The air felt heavy, almost tight against his skin. Jarath stepped through a moment later, and gave him a concerned look. "You all right?" Loghain frowned. "Uncertain." Jarath nodded. "This place," he looked around. "It seems it doesn't like non-elves." "Don't worry, it's a short trip." Loghain nodded, and followed Jarath. Despite him getting the sense that Jarath was slowing his pace considerably, he still had trouble keeping up with the smaller man. Eventually, they found themselves standing in front of what appeared to be a mirror. Once again, Jarath put his hand through, and allowed Loghain to pass. He breathed a sigh of relief to find himself out of the other area, feeling almost 50 pounds and 20 years lighter. The area they were in still seemed strange, with every sound echoing oddly. Where are we? Morrigan calls it the crossroads. He shrugged. A place between. Not quite the Fade, but, he shook his head. I don't really understand it all, Jarath admitted. These are doorways, he said, indicating the other mirrors. Most are dead, but a few still work. Jarath led them to another mirror, and once again they stepped through. This one led to what appeared to be a pleasant garden. Loghain looked around, and saw Morrigan approaching, followed by a young boy. The boy ran eagerly up to Jarath, and the elf swung him up into his arms. This is Kieran, Jarath said, pride evident in his voice. The boy smiled at Loghain shyly, and Loghain smiled back. A pleasure to meet you, Kieran, he said. Kieran, this is your grandpa Loghain. Say hello. Hello, the boy said, before burying his face in his father's neck. Loghain was surprised to feel tears pricking his eyes at the elf's words. I brought you a gift, he said, removing the small stuffed mulberry from his satchel. The child looked at it a moment before accepting it. He pulled it to him, and it barked. Kieran squealed, and then began to laugh delightedly. He climbed down, and then ran to his mother to show off his prize. Morrigan made proper noises of admiration before directing him to go play and joining the two men. Loghain, she said, nodding. Lady Morrigan, Loghain replied, giving her a slight bow. Jarath says you have had some success. Loghain nodded, and then removed the books from his satchel that he had stolen from the library, offering them to Morrigan. Her eyes widened, and she smiled. This is appreciated. I'm sure you two have much to discuss. I will go prepare a meal. He has your eyes, Loghain said, glancing at the elf. Jarath smiled. He's going to be making that thing bark constantly, you realize. Yes, that's why I bought it, Loghain responded. Jarath shook his head, and then smiled. Sit, he said, directing Loghain to a rather comfortable-looking set of benches. Morrigan brought them a meal, and the three discussed what they'd learned and how much they still had to learn for several hours. The two men sparred lightly by the lake, with Jarath instructing Loghain on the barehanded techniques. So you've been training with spirits? You could say that, Jarath replied. I've been exploring the Fade, trying to find information in the memories tucked inside. How is that going? Not as well as I'd like, Jarath admitted. The problem is there is just so much, and it's all a matter of perception. I won't be able to find answers until I know what questions to ask. He shrugged. And the most likely ones to know would be dwarves, who don't dream and thus aren't really observed by spirits. Loghain nodded. The books I brought have some collections of testimony from smugglers and others who have been in the deep roads. Perhaps they will give you a place to start. Will you need to return them? I found them in the bottom of the library, under about an inch of dust, Loghain replied. I doubt they will be missed. The wardens seem to have dismissed most such stories as Lyria maddling and tall tales. Some undoubtedly are, Jarath replied. What do you know about Kirkwall? Only what Carver reported, Loghain said. A memory I found in the Fade suggests that it may have originally been built as a site for a ritual. Possibly an attempt to duplicate the entry into the Fade. I let Nathaniel know. He'll be keeping an eye on the area. He's got some people of his own now, including one of Dworkin's apprentices. I'm having him collect Carver as well, just to be safe. Jarath shook his head. It's odd. I'm a little disturbed by the notion you could actually find something odd, Loghain replied. Jarath smiled. I can talk to you from the Fade, but it's difficult. I have to talk to you in kind of a dream between. But I can pull Nathaniel into the Fade and talk to him there. Last time I didn't even need to pull, he entered on his own. That is odd, Loghain said. Nathaniel is both younger and less stubborn than I am. Perhaps it's simply a matter of not being able to teach new tricks to an old dog. Loghain caught the elf's shoulder and swept the smaller man's leg out from under him. You got that one well enough, Jarath replied. It's a variation on skills I already possess, Loghain said, releasing the hold. This dream magic thing though. I wouldn't have thought what you do to be possible at all. And the fate is shaped by perception, Jiroth nodded. That might be all there is to it. He shrugged. Well, if Claral is willing to let you go into the field occasionally, I can just meet up with you that way. You aren't worried about being followed. No. It's a different path each time. I sense Morrigan, and so I know the right way to go, Jiroth said. Plus the path is hostile to non-elves. Even to folks like Morrigan. I can outrun anything there. It was uncomfortable, Loghain admitted, but worth the trip. Carver glanced at Nathaniel. It wasn't that he minded leaving Stroud's service, but the warden constable had been acting a bit strange the last couple days. Temarin didn't seem to think anything odd was going on, though being the cousin of Dworkin may have given the dwarf an unusual definition of odd. They were waiting on a fourth member of their party. This close to Kirkwall, Carver was starting to wonder if Anders would be joining them. Something brushed the edge of his senses, and he saw Nathaniel start to smile. I was starting to think you weren't coming, Nathaniel called out. Carver turned, and then his jaw dropped. Commander. He stared. You're dead. Missing, I believe, is the official statement, Jiroth said. He gave Carver a nod of greeting. Nathaniel and I are of the opinion you can be trusted. Would you agree? Yes, sir. Carver straightened. Good. You and your brother encountered a Magister in Vinmark. There are at least 5 others out there, locations unknown. Courtesy of Loghain, we have a lead. But, there is a complication. What's that? Carver asked. As you saw with Corypheus, these Magisters can influence any who have the corruption. That includes wardens. Possibly to the point of outright control. Nathaniel nodded. In Vinmark, you saw Corypheus nearly take control of Anders, and Anders even has justice to render aid. But, we are also wardens. Carver looked from one man to the other. And we don't know how compromised Weishaupt may be. Nathaniel sighed. The 3 of us, and Loghain, have some defense against the control. Hopefully, we can find something to help the others. But for now, this hunt is us. Jiroth met Carver's eyes. Ready? Yes, sir. Chapter 2, Vigilance. They cut through the Darkspawn Warren with the efficiency of long practice. There were fewer than they'd expected, though some of the emissaries were old enough for their magic to have more than a little sting. At least, they would have been, had 2 of their group not been Templars. Carver kicked one of the Genlock corpses over. Look at this armor. It's not Darkspawn make. Dwarven. Temarin nodded. Though not anything made in the last 7 or 8 centuries. He shrugged. Reckon it'd be worth a lot, to the right buyer. Well, no one said slaughtering every Darkspawn in Thedas had to be unprofitable. Nathaniel shook his head. Bring it. Jiroth shrugged. I know someone who might like to take a look at it. He'd thought his original warden training had been brutal. Okaren had thumped him around the courtyard regularly. But then, Okaren hadn't been an elf strong enough to put his fist through a silverite breastplate. Carver blocked the incoming blow and tried for a knife strike against the elf's throat. He had reach on the elf, but the smaller man's speed more than made up for it. He shifted his angle of attack, feinted, and managed to hook his leg around the commander's ankle. He twisted, and got the elf off his feet. A foot landed in his midsection as Jiroth pulled him off balance as well, and a moment later they were both laying on the ground. He's getting closer, Nathaniel said, looking up from where he was fletching arrows. Jiroth stood. Good. He offered Carver a hand up. Ribs okay. Bruised, but not cracked, Carver said as he twisted slightly to check. Temarin, how is it coming? The dwarf shrugged and looked up from where he was tinkering. Slow, but steady. Really not all that different from the one under the vigil. Give me a few more hours, and I think I can get it open. Carver poured himself a cup of tea and grabbed one of the elfroot potions. The Lady Morrigan had ensured they were well supplied for this. Or was she Lady Debris now? How legal was a ceremony between a missing warden and a witch of the wilds, conducted by an exiled Terran, in a place that if it actually existed wasn't technically in Thedas. They moved through the ancient Tag cautiously. From what Loghain had uncovered, it had been lost very early during the First Blight, and sealed by those fleeing the city in the hopes of slowing the Darkspawn down. Considering those events predated the Order by almost a century, he'd been lucky to uncover that much information. They'd had to go to one of Jarotha's contacts in Orzammar to actually uncover the location of the Tag, a risk he'd preferred to avoid. The silence was eerie. He pushed his senses out to their full range, and felt no Darkspawn. After a moment, he closed his eyes, and pushed his other senses out. Still no Darkspawn. He pulled back, then reopened his eyes. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow at him, and Jaroth shook his head. Nothing. Carver frowned. That doesn't make sense. If the city was overrun with Darkspawn, there should still be some here. They don't exactly starve. Could be they found another way out, Temarin said. There were 4 other blights that could have called them. He narrowed his eyes. The air is breathable. Means there must be enough passage for airflow. Then one would expect Tag crawlers, or deep stalkers, or... Nathaniel shook his head. Something. And the longer we go without something jumping out to try and eat us, the worse it's going to be when it actually happens, Jaroth said. How I wish you didn't have a point. Nathaniel kept his bow in hand. Let's find the shape rate, Temarin said. If there is anything useful here, it will be in there. What the hell is that? Nathaniel asked as the rocks began to roll together and take shape. Rock Wraith, Carver answered, drawing his sword. Great. How do we kill it? Carver shrugged. My brother blew it up with some lightning. He winced as more rocks began to move. Of course, there was only one. Jaroth glanced at Temarin. Got any of those little bombs? Temarin drew some of the metal spheres out of his pack. 4. Nathaniel, fire arrows, see if you can find a weak point. Carver, circle left, try to keep them focused on you. Jaroth took the spheres, then began to circle around. Carver circled the other way, and yelled a war cry. All 3 beasts turned towards him. He slashed, and was pleasantly surprised to note that the rune enchantments on the blade did seem to be doing some good. A few moments later, there was a loud boom, and one of the wraiths went flying in all directions. There was some relief when it didn't reform. Jaroth tossed Carver one of the bombs, and moved in to target another wraith. Jaroth bent, examining the ancient ingots. They looked like silverite, but seemed to glow of their own accord. He added them to the travois, and went to check on Temarin. Any luck? It's an old dialect. Even the dwarves haven't spoken Dwarven in a few centuries. Temarin frowned. The memories look like they are intact, but I'm having trouble actually accessing them. He stood, then directed Carver and Nathaniel to make rubbings of some of the carvings. I've never seen most of these runes. We'll get them to the shape rate eventually, Jaroth assured him. Take a look here. These is a reference to the old gods. And, as you can see. 8. Jaroth sighed. And yet all human, elven, and Orzammar history clearly states 7. Temarin nodded. Memories can be altered. Sedita caused no end of headache, what with being stripped out and then added back. As a paragon no less. Anything that might tell us why. Need time to process, boss. Nathaniel was about to pronounce the stew edible when Temarin came out of the other room, eyes wide. Commander. Yes. Temarin swallowed. If the memories are correct then. He closed his eyes, then reopened them. They sealed the gates because it was here. Jaroth stood. Wardens, we've got a job to do. Thoughts? Carver frowned. I can't call it a weakling, Commander. But it had nothing on Corypheus. Jaroth examined the corpse. It looks rather like the architect. Not a comforting observation. Nathaniel sighed. But I think your theory regarding him is correct. Is it dead? Temarin asked. Looks that way. Injuries. Busted ribs, Carver replied. That lightning spell did me no favors. Nathaniel winced as he moved. Though, frankly, it probably should have killed me outright. He shook his head. I could get used to this resistance thing. Jiroth smiled. Just don't test the limits. Rather not find out the hard way that it doesn't work on ice spells or something. He glanced at Carver. Good on the mana drain. Thank you, sir. Tamarin stepped out of where he'd been sheltering. Did we get what we came here for, sir? More than. Jiroth rose. Strip what we need. Remember, we won't get a second chance here. Once the dwarves start sending expeditions, we won't be able to come back. What now? Nathaniel asked. Now. Jiroth shrugged. We follow up on the information we learned here, and hope Morrigan or Loghain can fill in gaps. And bring that weird Silverite. He glanced at the others. Shortcut or long way home? Long way. The answer from the others was almost simultaneous. Jiroth bit back a yelp when Danya's foot connected with his shin. The little dwarven woman let out a rather impressive string of curses, and then threw her arms around his waist. He heard her let out a sob as she clung to him. You're alive. Yes. He tried to extract himself from the hug, and she just tightened her arms. He sighed, and waited until she was done. You're alive. She stepped back, and then aimed another kick at him. This one he managed to dodge. Everyone thinks you're dead. I know. He sighed. And they need to keep thinking that. Then. She shook her head. Why are you here? Because I need your help. He nodded. You are absolutely brilliant, and... He put a hand on her shoulder. You're someone I know I can trust. A wide smile came to Danya's face. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded to him. All right. Let's get to work. Tamarin coughed, and tasted blood in his mouth. He could feel the taint creeping in his blood. If he didn't get out of here soon, the others wouldn't have a chance to find him. He took a few more steps, and staggered. Something touched his shoulder, more sensation than contact. He blinked, and stared at what appeared to be a copy of the Warden Commander, carved out of what looked to be dark green stone. The eyes were emerald fire. And realization came. You're the spirit. Yes. The voice was a deeper version of the commander's, one with a curious echo to it. Come, it is not much further. Can't. Tamarin swallowed and then coughed up more blood. It's in my blood. Get back to the others, tell them. They know. They are coming, but the area is collapsing. You need to keep moving. The spirit beckoned Tamarin to follow. I can guide you. He stumbled forward a few more steps, and then nearly fell again. Stone. I can't. Tamarin. The spirit shook its head. I cannot carry you. He nodded. Go. No need for both of us to. I will not leave you. The spirit's eyes blazed. Tamarin coughed again. I need help. The spirit tilted its head. Tamarin. I need help. Tamarin nodded. I'm not going to make it, not this way. Just until we get to the others. You can do that, right? It won't hurt you. The spirit frowned. I do not know. It nodded. And I will not leave you. It touched his shoulder again. He felt something flow, energizing him. The shape in front of him vanished, and a moment later so did the pain. It felt as if a healing spell had been cast on him. Go. The voice was in his head now. Tamarin got back to his feet, and started moving. Are you feeling all right? Jiroth sat down next to him. He wasn't hurt, was he? Tamarin raised an eyebrow. I didn't hurt him. He's fine. Jiroth nodded. If anything, he's stronger now. He got a name. No, actually. Jiroth frowned. I've always just thought of him as the other. Yeah. Like another you, only he's. Tamarin shrugged. Another you, watching out for us. Keeping a vigil. Vigilance. They looked up to see the spirit take shape. Yes. Nathaniel tried not to laugh as Danya attempted to put Vigilance onto a scale. The spirit was staring at her with a slightly bemused expression. Danya tapped the scale. Okay, we've killed demons, and they've left behind residue, so clearly you are made of something. She tapped the scale again. That shade left behind 9.7 ounces of material. So logically, you should weigh something. I can, if you wish. Vigilance looked down at her. No, that's... She blinked up at him. Can you? The scale abruptly shifted. She stared at it. That shouldn't work. You shouldn't able to not weigh and then weigh. Are you summoning material from the... She started doing the rapid-fire talking thing. After almost a full minute of such, she held up a small knife, and turned towards Vigilance. Can I take a sample? Vigilance blinked at her, and then turned towards where Temarin was sitting. Temarin? That's actually a really good question. I mean, is she physically able to take a sample of you, or would it poof into? Vigilance abruptly vanished, stepping back into the fade. That. Temarin turned towards Danya. I think that was a no. But he possessed you. Danya pointed the dagger at him. Can I take a dash? No. Chapter 3, Kirkwall. Morrigan smiled as she watched her son and husband. Jarath moved through the sword form. Kiran followed, his movements steadier than she would have expected for his age. After another repeat of the form, they started to spar. As usual, the match didn't last long before Kiran dissolved into fits of laughter as his father continually missed him by a foot or more with each swing while admonishing Kiran to stay still. Jarath carried him over to where she was standing. He kissed one of her cheeks, and Kiran leaned forward to kiss the other. Her laughter was warm as she led her family into dinner. Carver smiled as his senses pinged, then stepped out from his hiding place. Loghain nodded and headed in his direction. Junior. General. He glanced over his shoulder. No spawn. Just a few risen corpses. Took care of it. He raised an eyebrow. You seem less grumpy than usual. I am. Loghain shrugged. Some of the Orlshians turning out to be tolerable company. Carver fell into step beside him as they headed to their actual destination. One or two. Loghain shrugged. And I hear Sigrun paid you a visit. Carver smiled innocently. I do have some news from the Vigil, yes. Loghain nodded. Right. Because the two of you just talked. Carver chuckled. Loghain sighed. It is. He frowned. It is more difficult, keeping the secret from her than it is from the others. She. He shook his head. He meant a lot to her. Yeah. Carver sighed. Yeah. But. No. Loghain shrugged. His reasons for leaving her out are sound. The Vigil is her home. But unlike the others, she's your friend. Carver nodded. No, I get it. Danya hesitated, and then tentatively spoke aloud. I promise not to try to take any samples. I just want to ask you some questions. A few moments later, the spirit pushed through, appearing in front of her. Very well. Vigilance nodded to her. She took a deep breath, and then giggled. I'm just not sure where to start. What? She looked up at him. What is the fade like? Loghain followed Jarath out of the mirror. The ruins that served as their base appeared more comfortable than they had on the last visit. He paused as they walked past one of the rooms, and looked inside. Danya sat across the table from a figure carved out of fade stuff. She was sketching what appeared to be an intricate diagram while throwing rapid-fire questions at the being. Loghain turned, and raised an eyebrow at Jarath. I tried to ask. Jarath shrugged. As near as I can tell, she's trying to figure out how spirits are born. Loghain glanced at the room again before he fell into step with Jarath once more. Admit to some slight concern as to what may happen if she finds an answer. Jarath stopped short. Well. He shook his head. Thanks. I needed a new flavor of nightmare. A focus for the old gods. Jarath raised an eyebrow. What information I could find was limited. Loghain shook his head. I believe it was used to determine their locations. However, as we do know the wardens actually know the locations. Then at the very least, we should recover it before someone else does. Jarath nodded. The Fade, Danya said triumphantly. Jarath blinked. Danya, remember what I said about not being able to read your mind? Oh, right. I figured out that Silvrite you brought me. She continued talking, chattering about harmonic structures and intertransiency and many other words he was convinced she made up on the spot. All right, slow down. He tilted his head at her. You are trying to tell me that the Silvrite absorbed energy from a weakness in the veil. Yes, she said. Like your dragon bone blade. She gestured. Carver, come here. Carver walked over cautiously, and Danya offered him a great sword. He took it gingerly, and she gestured at where she'd set up a combat dummy. Go, try it out. The last time I did this, my hand was numb for 3 hours. Carver held the sword carefully. That was his sword. This one's yours. She bounced eagerly. Go on, give it a try. He swung it experimentally a few times. On the 5th swing, there was a blast of lightning that arced to the other 2 dummies, blasting the stuffing out of one. Danya clapped gleefully. Ah, so that's what it does. You. Jarath looked down at her. Didn't know what it would do. Well, I was reasonably sure it wouldn't hurt him. I insulated the grip. Danya gestured. Look at the sheen on his armor now. The other effect seems to be to provide a limited sort of barrier. Not quite as good as having a mage shield you, mind, but should take some of the sting out of a hit. Carver turned the blade around in his hands. I like it. Jarath shook his head. How are you coming with the memories? A lot of it's useless, Danya said. Genealogies, stuff that barely mattered when they recorded it. I did find some interesting bits. Used a little in making that sword. Working on a shield next. I'm going to need dragon blood. We'll get right on that. Not dragonling blood, either. High dragon. And a revenant heart. Silvrite takes well to enchantments that hurt darkspawn, and I can use the dragon blood to make it more effective against demons. Should work well with Carver's Templar abilities. She snatched the blade back from Carver and put it onto the workbench before fiddling with it some more. Make a list, we'll see what we can find. Anything else Fade touched? So they took this focus to Kirkwall. If this information regarding this band of 3 is accurate, Morrigan looked over the map. Then yes. Kirkwall was the site of a great blood magic ritual. It may actually be the original site of the attempt to breach the Fade, though I have my doubts. Twould make sense that the focus is there. Jarath nodded slowly. It wasn't the original site. But they did attempt to deliberately thin the veil. Look at the old map. Tevinter glyphs in the streets. Nathaniel shook his head. So, how do we find this focus? Get close enough, it should call. Jarath shook his head. The focus was tied to the Forgotten One. The 8th old god. That's far more disturbing an answer than I was hoping for, Carver said. Well, then you really aren't going to like the next part. Jarath shook his head. The messenger is coming along on this run. Danya made some words that should contain the corruption, keep him safe. Where is he now? Loghain is getting him. We'll pick them both up and be on our way. Going to have to be the shortcut, this time. We dare not let the focus be uncontained for long. Carver smiled. The general is coming along. Should be fun. We'll need to get in and out quickly, without being seen. Temarin looked over the map. And this can't be accurate. It was accurate, Nathaniel said. 700 years ago. So we are going hunting for 12,000-year-old secret caches using a 700-year-old map made by someone who had no clue the caches existed. Loghain shook his head. This is being hopeless, the messenger added. And it is not being good to take me into a city. We need you. If this information is correct, you may be the only one that can get close enough. Danya's words should keep you safe and people safe from you. Keep your helmet down. You too, Loghain. Kirkwall has plenty of Feraldans, but to the best of my knowledge, only one warden. Jarath glanced at them. And Anders' senses were dismal at best. We should sense him long before he senses any of us. Get in, get the cash, get back through the thingy before it shuts on us. Carver sighed. That does not leave us a lot of contingency time. He shook his head. What if we run into my brother? Nathaniel smirked. It's a big city. What are the odds? An ancient Tevinter hideout, underneath Kirkwall? Carver shook his head. Why am I not surprised? Nathaniel disarmed the traps, while Jarath went to work on the wards. They moved forward, keeping their eyes open. Thus far, they'd been attacked by demons 3 times. Jarath considered that a good sign. If what they were looking for had been taken, the wards and demons likely wouldn't still be around. He nodded at Carver, and the 2 men took up positions next to the barrier. They concentrated, focusing their Templar abilities to bring it down. The messenger moved quickly, leaping inside. As Morrigan had suggested, the sentinels ignored the dark spawn. They were only to attack the living. He grabbed the relic, and returned. Carver and Jarath let the barrier spring back up. They came up from the tunnels. Nathaniel blinked. I'm pretty sure Kirkwall wasn't on fire when we went down there. Sod it, Temerin muttered. Move, Jarath ordered. They hadn't gone far when the horned giants attacked. Carver suddenly blinked, and pointed. Avellini. Nathaniel turned, and put an arrow in the eye of the Cunary threatening the woman. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure that both the messenger and Loghain were hidden by their helms. At least he didn't sense Anders. Between their party and the group that included this Avellini, they made short work of the Cunary. Carver glanced at his brother. It was, after all, why he was wearing warden armor. An invasion in a city on fire? Somehow, I knew it would be you. Carver, Gabriel said. Hello, big brother. Fancy meeting you here. Carver shrugged, then glanced at the other wardens. Gabriel had never met Loghain, or Jarath. Avellini, however, had possibly encountered both, and would almost certainly recognize Loghain. Which would be bad for multiple reasons. He strode over, trying to keep them focused on him. Nathaniel retrieved his arrows. This attack was, most unexpected. Carver sighed. He wanted to help, but if they delayed any longer, the way back would be closed. With the thing unworded, they needed to get it to Morrigan as swiftly as possible. Nathaniel, we need to move. We've already delayed too long. Very true. I cannot believe the Cunary would dare such an attack. This will lead to war with the Free Marches for certain. Nathaniel glanced at the others, who were staring, and spread his hands. I fear pressing matters take us elsewhere, but we can spread word to the other free cities. Perhaps they will bring aid. There's something more important than an invasion. His brother's face held a look of disbelief. We can't talk about it, Carver said. Morrigan knew what she was getting into, and had Jarath. His brother would be in far greater danger. It wasn't a risk he was willing to take, even if he did know Gabriel would have been willing. Nathaniel nodded. The Cunary are of far greater concern to you, I am certain, but we must return to our mission. Goodbye, big brother. Take care of yourself. He hated this. His brother was going into a war, and he was just walking away. Still, he knew Gabriel. And Avellini. He'd bet on them. Make her watch over you, my friend, Nathaniel said. Morrigan finished the wards, sealing the focus away. She turned and crossed the room to where Jarath stood. I am not certain what the original purpose of that item was, but 'tis elven. She folded her arms. It does not amplify power, not like some of the other foci I have read about. 'Tis. She shook her head. More like a staff, designed to direct specific energies. To what purpose, I cannot say. It's a key. Jarath frowned. A key. Morrigan raised an eyebrow. How come you buy this notion? I don't know. And I'm not sure what it is a key to. Jarath rubbed the back of his neck. One of those memories I shouldn't have. But it's a key. And I'm relieved it's safely under our control. She caressed the side of his cheek as she gave him a worried look. He answered her with a reassuring smile, and she kissed him. I could see if I can get more information from you. Her eyes danced. Oh. He raised an eyebrow. Do you have something in mind? Her laughter was low. Come to bed. And I'll show you. Well. He let her lead him towards their room. Now I'm scared. Chapter 4, Mark of the Assassin. Carver smiled when he saw Loghain. You found us something. I found something that may be able to find something. An abandoned warden outpost from the Fourth Blight. Jarath raised an eyebrow. That's a little recent. True, but hear me out. Loghain laid out a map. It was commanded by none other than the warden mage Isia, sister of Gurahel. She created an underground lake. Impressive, Nathaniel commented. And there are two other things true about this place. Considerable warden lore dealing with magic was relocated here to keep it safe as other outposts were lost. Loghain gestured at the map. And it appears that the sickness that ultimately killed off the griffins may have originated at this location. You think it might have been contamination from something Magister related? I think it is a possibility we cannot discount. Loghain looked up. Blood magic was used to hold Corypheus. At this point in the Fourth Blight, there were a number of rumors that Isia and no few others among the warden mages and their adherents were blood mages. How do we get in? Nathaniel asked. Duke Prosper is holding a wyvern hunt. Loghain shrugged. I suggest you go in the front door. Carver grinned. Always wanted to hunt one of those. What? Temerin elbowed him. High dragons and ogre alphas aren't good enough for you anymore. Jarath shook his head. Duke Prosper will know you on sight, Loghain, and likely pay attention to a dwarven guest. You, Nathaniel, and Temerin stay on the outskirts. Carver and I will go in. Like you won't be noticed, Temerin muttered. Ah, but I'm not going in as a warden, Jarath said. It's Orlays. They won't look once at an elf in servant clothing. An Orlshian party. Carver let out a long-suffering sigh. I'd say it beats busting up another Darkspawn warren. Nathaniel shook his head. But that really isn't true, is it? We have a problem, Carver whispered. I noticed. Jarath narrowed his eyes at the incoming group. What is your brother doing here? Heralding an oncoming storm. Carver shook his head. What now? Anders will definitely recognize me. Jarath considered a moment. Go visit with your brother. If nothing else, I'm sure whatever he's doing here will make a great distraction. Help him if he needs it. Yes, Commander. Carver waited for the other man to vanish, then started walking towards where his brother was talking with Duke Prosper. Anders approached him as soon as they were out of earshot of the other guests. Carver, I ran into Leliana, and she said that the commander. Carver sighed, and nodded. He left for Denerim the same time Stroud and I left for the Free Marches. There had been riots, and an incident in the alienage. He was supposed to take ship back to Amaranthin the next day, but instead his cousin delivered the commander's helmet to the vigil with a note saying that Setida was to be the warden commander. He didn't say where he was going. No. Carver looked down, then looked back to Anders. The incident that caused the rioting in the alienage was the murder of the Elvish Ban. Wasn't the Elvish Ban? His father, yes. I would ask if you thought that was why he left, but... Anders shook his head. If you told me he pulled Fort Dricken down with his bare hands in response, that, I'd believe. But not simply leaving. Warden Commander Setida was already on her way to Amaranthin due to receiving a request for her presence from Commander Jarath. Clearly, he expected to be leaving. She arrived only 2 days after he'd vanished, shocked to find him gone. Isabella spoke up from where she'd been shamelessly eavesdropping. I met him once. He beat me at cards. I was cheating heavily, but he beat me anyway. She shook her head. Never saw it coming. Anders frowned, then looked back at Carver. You don't suppose that, the commander, well he did survive killing an archdemon, perhaps the calling came sooner for him than normal, and he simply did not want to make a fuss. Warden Commander Setida had the same theory. Still, no one in Orzammar ever saw him arrive. Nathaniel snickered. Let me get this straight. He glanced at Carver. Our distraction for robbing Chateau Haine is, your brother is here to rob Chateau Haine. Yes. We have had worse plans, Giroth said. True. Nathaniel glanced at Carver. How big a distraction do you think your brother is going to provide? Well, he did put down a Cunary invasion more or less single-handedly. And he's an Amel mage. Giroth shrugged. Never a good idea to get in the way of one of those. He glanced at Carver. Stick with your brother. If we end up getting him in more trouble than he can handle, give a shout. Yes, Commander. An Avar altar, dedicated to the Lady of the Skies. Giroth shrugged. We can't get in yet. Might as well check it out. Nothing like a battle with demons to get the blood pumping, Nathaniel said. He downed an Elfroot potion. Loghain shook his head. Anything useful? A ceremonial knife of some kind, and a book. Perhaps Morrigan can make use of them, Giroth said. Let's get out of here before anyone sees us. Nathaniel pointed. Looks like the party is ending. Shall we head in? Let's move. Carver found him, and gestured urgently. Giroth moved towards him, keeping his face turned away from the young Dalish woman that was accompanying Carver. She appeared engrossed in the plants winding up the fence. Leliana and Arl Tegan are both in attendance. Bruhan. If he's here, I didn't see him, but... If he's here, we are already screwed, Giroth said. Tegan, Leliana, your brother. Is the first warden also in attendance? Flemeth. The latter wouldn't really surprise me all that much. Me either, Giroth said. Keep your head down. If you run into Bruhan, point out your brother is also here, then make your escape as soon as you can. We'll meet you back at the port. Yes, sir. Who is your friend? Merrill. Try to have fun. Carver laughed softly. Will do. Nathaniel blinked. He could see the champion and the elven woman skulking about. The guard below him caught sight of them as well, and started to stand. Nathaniel shrugged, picked up a small statue, and dropped it onto the guard's head before ducking back into the shadows. Amateurs. Carver sensed two wardens, and headed in the other direction. Okay, we're lost together. Both of us, not that we're together. He'd helped kill two of the original Magisters, fought a high dragon, and walked through lands that didn't technically exist. How did one elven mage get him so twisted up? If we have to be lost somewhere, at least it's a nice hallway. Merrill gestured. Very well built, not at all likely to collapse. Right, well, back to rescuing. He stopped dead in his tracks and stared at her. Wait. You're doing that on purpose. She giggled before running on. He shook his head, smiled, and followed. Giroth picked up a tray, and walked into the chateau with the rest of the servants while Leliana was distracted. Once inside, he simply walked through as if he had a perfect right to be there. Nobody even looked at him twice. He could sense Nathaniel moving around on the floor above them. He opened a window, and waited while Loghain and Temerin entered. If your information is right, there should be an entrance down in the vaults. Loghain nodded. This is really not how I pictured invading Orlais. Nathaniel tilted his head, and glanced down. Anders has been wandering the sublevel for the past half hour, going in circles. Giroth blinked. Is he lost? Or insane? Nathaniel shrugged. Your guess is as good as mine. 04. Giroth shook his head. Let's find this cache and get out of here. I don't know. We could stay here and watch the mages try to be sneaky. Nathaniel shook his head. It's surprisingly entertaining. He started moving, then stopped. The floor is trapped. Can you get it? I can, but it will take me a few minutes. We don't have a few minutes. Nathaniel considered. There is probably a switch or something that shuts them off. But it would likely be on the... He pointed. There. That's less than helpful, Temerin said. How are we supposed to get to it? Nathaniel and Loghain both turned to look at Giroth. He sighed. You know, in some countries, elf tossing is illegal. And in others, it's a national sport. Loghain shook his head. This is Orlais. A problem. Oh. Lovely. Haven't had one of those in 5 whole minutes. Jarath glanced at Temarin. What now? I found the cache. That seems like the opposite of a problem. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow at the dwarf. It's in there. Temarin pointed at the lake. Ah. That would be a problem then. It's only about 2 feet down, but it's a good 30 feet into the rock and behind a barrier door. Even if we could hold our breath long enough to get the door open, the water would destroy what we came for as soon as we opened the door. It's not really a problem, Loghain said. How is that not a problem? Temarin asked. Well, I suppose if you have an issue with getting a lot of Orlchians wet, it's a problem. Temarin, find me a good spot to blow a hole in a mountain. Jarath smiled. We'll send the Duke a letter of apology later. What was that? Merrill asked, glancing around after the castle rumbled. If he had to guess, he'd say one of Dworkin's toys. Carver shook his head. Probably nothing. He gestured for them to keep moving. A door led them to a pleasant garden. Merrill picked a flower and tucked it behind her ear. Should we head back in? He shook his head. Let's try circling around the chateau, finding our original entrance. Maybe we can track the others. This is exciting, isn't it? She fell into step next to him. Do you do this often? Hunt through Orlchian palaces looking for my brother. He laughed. No. Normally we hunt through palaces looking for Darkspawn. He wasn't sure, exactly, when they'd taken each other's hands. For a moment, he let himself forget all the real reasons he was there. He was strolling through a garden with Merrill. Commander. Nathaniel said. He pointed. Loghain swore quietly. What are they doing here? Jarath sighed as he observed Carver's brother and several others, including Anders, entering the deeps. Blocking our escape. Wait for them to pass. Temarin suggested. Soldiers began to head after the champion. Or not. Well, there is a nice hole in the mountain. Can you swim? We had a plan when we came in here, Nathaniel said. I distinctly remember us having a plan. Are those Qunari? Loghain asked. Temarin nodded. At least now there is a cover story for why part of the mountain exploded. Nathaniel shook his head. You know, I always thought Carver was exaggerating when he talked about his brother. Only because you never knew Lenore, Jarath said. She couldn't have been that bad. In the time I knew her, she accidentally summoned 5 demons, 9 revenants, and a high dragon. He considered a moment. Some of the revenants might have been on purpose. How does one summon a high dragon? Temarin asked. A gong on a mountainside. Let's get moving. Are you coming back to Kirkwall? Merrill asked hopefully. Carver sighed, and shook his head. I can't. I'd like to, but I'm a warden now. But you'll visit, right? She laid a hand on his arm. She was beautiful. He could spend a lifetime lost in her eyes. It had been fun, fighting alongside his brother. Fighting alongside Merrill. But after the last couple years, his brother's battles just seemed small. He ran his fingers through Merrill's hair. She put a hand around the back of his neck, then rose up on her toes to kiss him. Time went away. That's a lot of Qunari, actually. Nathaniel touched his bow. Technically, I think they are Talvashoth, Temarin said. Loghain shook his head. Whatever they are, if they make it up the hill, Carver and his brother are going to be in a lot of trouble. Jarath drew his weapons. Let's give them a hand, shall we? Merrill led him a bit away from the others. When they were alone, he wrapped his arms around her and kissed her again. She was light in his arms. Stay. She whispered into his ear. Just for a little while. I can't, Carver said. Letting her go felt like cutting his arms off. You don't know how much I wish I could. Her eyes watered. Duty calls. He ran his fingers down the side of her face. If it were anything less than the world at stake. She giggled. Jiroth was soaking wet. Carver blinked. Sir. Carver. Jiroth just shook his head. Don't ask. We should get going, sir. Carver glanced back over his shoulder. The world is in danger. Jiroth laughed softly, and shook his head. The world is always in danger. It will keep a few more hours. Sir. Go. Remember why it's worth saving. Carver's face broke into a smile. Yes, sir. He found her only a few feet from where he'd left her, sniffing at the blossom on a tree. Meryl. She turned back to him, and her face lit up. Carver. He saw the elven woman leave the champion and head off on her own. Quietly, he followed. When she moved through the crowd, he took the opportunity to brush past her. Did we retrieve anything useful? A chest marked with a seal saying it's for the Warden Commander's eyes only. Loghain glanced at Jiroth. Jiroth nodded, and unrolled the map. It was clearly a few hundred years old, but the markings on it were distinct enough. If this information is correct, one of the apprentices to the original Magisters was one of the forces behind the origin of the first Grey Wardens. She joined forces with a scholar to develop the joining. Morrigan raised an eyebrow. Interesting. And the information she brought to the Wardens included this. He gestured at the map. The original Magisters had uncovered the locations of all the old gods. She shook her head. We knew the Grey Wardens know the locations. You got that much from the Archaea? She took a second look at the map. This is different. It is. Luzakin in the western approach, Razikale under Lake Callanhood, and this symbol. Directly beneath Weishaupt. Morrigan stared at the map. Loghain shook his head. So is Weishaupt compromised by a Magister, an archdemon, or something else? I don't know. Anything else? Morrigan asked. Jiroth set another scroll on the table. A list of all Qunari agents in Thedas. Carver blinked. How did you get that? I thought Talus took it. Remind me to teach you how to pick a pocket. It's a useful skill. Chapter 5, God damn it, Anders. Danya let out a breath, watching the colors dance in her head. The memories flowed through her. And then Vigilance stepped away again. She could still feel him though. A warm, protective presence just a thought away. She stood there a moment, lost in the sensation. Then she turned to where he stood. Thank you. Impulsively, she hugged the spirit. He reacted much the same way the Warden Commander did. Immediate attempt at retreat, and then resigned acceptance. Your curiosity has been sated, then. No. She giggled. It's been whetted. She let him go. But I won't ask you to do that again. I know you don't like doing it. It is not. Vigilance shook his head. Dislike is the wrong word. Echoes of yourselves are left upon me. I am a different me than I was when this began. The commander says you are stronger. Danya raised an eyebrow at him. How does that work? I am more, because you are more. Vigilance shrugged, the gesture mirroring the Warden Commander's habitual tendency. You hold the vigil, and I am Vigilance. Because your purpose, and the more dedicated we are to the purpose, the stronger you get. Danya nodded. I reflect your natures. Is that why you don't like Orlshians? It was funny, almost, listening to the Warden Commander's voice do an almost perfect imitation of Loghain's. They talk entirely too much for people who say nothing. She couldn't quite suppress a giggle, and then she tilted her head up at him. So you're sarcastic, fatalistic, overprotective, ready for a good fight, don't like Orlshians or ceremonies, and you hate Darkspawn. She giggled. You are definitely the spirit of the Wardens. Let me get this straight. Loghain raised an eyebrow at the Antavan nobleman. You're going to go talk to the prince, and tell him you are being blackmailed. On an accusation of being a Qunari spy. By Loghain MacTier. I.E.R. The man swallowed. Well, when you put it that way. He sighed. I will have the materials ready by the end of the week. Loghain nodded, then walked out of the room. You are having entirely too much fun, Carver said, falling into step beside him. I spend most of my time battling cobwebs and dust mites in the dankiest portion of a library. Loghain shook his head. Shaking down the occasional Antivan breaks up the monotony. When do you have to be back? Whenever I'm done with my inspection of the southern caches. Loghain twitched a shoulder. But since you and Nathaniel cleaned all of them out last year, I have some time to spare. He glanced at the younger man. How is your training coming? I took down the commander. Carver smiled proudly. Well, 1 out of 6 matches, anyway. He glanced back over his shoulder. What would you do if he actually did report you to Clairol? Inquire how, precisely, I managed to get from Montaglace to Islay in a day. He shook his head. At this rate, we'll have the entire Ben Hasrat mapped out in a few months. Nathaniel stood behind Kieran, helping the boy properly position the bow. Now, aim with your strong eye, and line up the shot. Gentle release, just let your fingers brush back, like you were combing hair away from your cheek. The boy did as he was told, then smiled as the arrow hit just outside the bullseye. Like that, Uncle Nathaniel. Exactly like that. Keep practicing, and pretty soon you'll be shooting down wyverns. He left the lad to practice when he saw Jarath enter the garden. He walked over. Trouble. Another dead end. Jarath marked the map. If there is anything in Garith Altaig, we'd need to spend the next 10 years digging it out. I've set a spirit to keep an eye, just in case, but I think we can cross it off the list. The list is getting rather short. Nathaniel sighed. We might be going after this the wrong way. Oh. Thus far we've been going on Warden information. Granted, it's what we have access to, but it only goes back to the first blight. The old gods were already sleeping then. He glanced down at the map. Do you remember how Carver told us he contracted the blight? A dwarven tague that predated Paragons. Jarath nodded slowly. I'll retrieve him from Antiva, and we'll see if he can find it again. As much as I'd like to join you, I should be returning to Orlais. Loghain sighed. He glanced at Nathaniel. According to Sigrun, Setida is very angry you haven't been returning her missives. I haven't ignored all her missives, Nathaniel said. Just the ones requesting I return to the vigil. Jarath sighed. We may have to come up with a reason for her to leave you be in the marches. Maybe arrange a sighting of Talking Darkspawn. The messenger would likely be amiable to giving us a hand there. Have him be encountered by Cunary. Loghain gestured at the map. Still some in the area. They'll report to the new Arishik, and he'll contact Setida for information. She won't question it from him. Good idea. Jarath glanced up. I'll walk you back to Orlais. Carver, go over the maps with Nathaniel, see if you can't retrace the route. On it. Explosives are good for demolitions and excavations, but not for transporting. Jarath sighed. Much as I dislike the idea, we need a few more people. Nathaniel shrugged. I can hire Ser Fenley again. His people are competent, but he's a known liar. Even if he claims to have worked with us, no one will actually believe him. Do it. What the hell kind of lyrium is that? Britain, the apostate that served in Ser Fenley's company, reached out. Jarath grabbed his hand. The kind you shouldn't touch. He shook his head. Like all other kinds of lyrium. Oh. Right. Temarin got out his equipment, and carefully took a sample to take back to Danya. Jarath considered telling him to leave it. Something about the stuff was tickling the parts of his memory that weren't wholly his. Let's get what we came for, and not linger. Temarin. The memory's here. Temarin shook his head. They're wrong, Commander. What do you mean? I mean they are all jumbled and twisted up, like the rantings of madmen. Half of them are glowing red. He frowned. I'm not touching that red stuff. Good. Don't. Jarath narrowed his eyes. He could hear something whispering. He let his mind drift, seeking among the memories that weren't his. A moment later, he was certain. Blow it. Sir. The whole chamber. We can't use it, and what's here shouldn't fall into the wrong hands. Blow it. Aye, Commander. Didn't the architect say the area was clear of darkspawn? Carver cut down an emissary. He said to the best of his knowledge, the area was clear of darkspawn, but his people hadn't been through the area in a couple months. Jiroth sighed. The situation apparently changed. He looked around, then half closed his eyes. Nathaniel is back by that cave-in, but he's alive. Temarin is by the golems. Last I saw Ser Fenley, he and his men were running for it. Idiots. Agreed. Nathaniel put an arrow in the Genlock Alpha's eye. He sensed a warden approaching, and turned, expecting to see Carver. Instead, he saw Carver's brother. Nathaniel, how? The man asked. He nodded. You're the champion of Kirkwall, aren't you? And? His gaze went to the others, and he found the man who was pinging his senses. Anders. Anders actually had the nerve to give him a friendly smile. Making friends as always, I see. He'd considered Justice a good friend. And Anders had. He smiled back. There's no escaping you, it seems. I'm special that way. That's one way to put it. He moved to retrieve his arrows, mostly so he didn't have to look at the other man. The champion asked him questions, and he answered carefully, lying where he had to, but not enough that Anders would call him out. He could still sense a large number of darkspawn. Too many to risk sending help away. When the champion suggested they leave, he shook his head. I cannot leave now. When we were attacked, I was separated from the rest of my expedition. Some of them may yet live. We must go deeper into the tunnels to rescue them. Who else could be alive? The champion asked. Your brother, for starters. I know he survived the initial ambush, as did the dwarf. He didn't mention the other warden with them. Ser Fenley and his men weren't equipped for fighting that many darkspawn. But who still lives? Only the Maker knows. The champion and his companions didn't hesitate for a moment to follow him in. You got this. Ser. Anders is with Nathaniel. Carver nodded. I got this. Good man. I'll see if I can't track Fenley and his buffoons. Jiroth headed off into the tunnels. He found Temarin at the fallback point. Fenley and his men ran smack into a darkspawn trap. No survivors. All dead by the time I reached them. Jiroth kicked a rock. How many times did I tell him to stay within sight of a warden? 73, by my count. Temarin shrugged. Wasted trip. I disagree. Ser. We destroyed the memories. That alone was worth the trip. He shook his head. Though I'm not sure I could tell you why. The dwarf nodded. Something is stirring in the deep. One way to put it, I suppose. He shook his head. Nathaniel and the others are on their way here. I'll go on ahead, open the door. Yes, Commander. Temarin. Anders. Dworkin finally had to make a run for it. He nodded. Qunari sent assassins after him. Full-on death squad. I guess they didn't like the competition. Or maybe they were jealous. Did he ever get those rune-based fuses to work? Oh, yeah. Got a nice boom to those. Temarin shrugged. That's right, you were the one made the runes for him to play with. Almost lost 2 apprentices the first time he tried those out. I'd love to see how he worked out the storage issue. You mean with them sweating? Temarin nodded. Yeah, that actually did cost him an apprentice. He fumbled through his pack, and handed Anders some parchment. See for yourself. He adjusted the mix so the ingredients didn't separate. Clever. Anders looked up. Looks like it's time to leave. Mind if I take this? Go ahead. Chapter 6, The Last Straw. The wisp found him in the fade, and glowed brightly. Jiroth nodded, and then moved the dream around him. He stepped into the spirit's domain, and pulled Loghain in. You called. I found something. Meet me tomorrow, at the doorway by White Rock. Loghain was pacing impatiently when he stepped out of the gateway. Loghain. I found one. Loghain tapped his satchel. Or at least, I think I have. You've got to be kidding me, Carver said. They built it atop the ruins of the old city. Built the glyphs directly into the streets. Loghain tapped one of the rolled scrolls. Hundreds of slaves were sacrificed every year to thin the veil. It's not a city, it's a sodding ritual chamber, Temarin said. Kirkwall. Jarath stared at the map. How did we miss that? Danya spread out the map. Okay, if my understanding of Tevinter glyphs is correct, then my guess would be. She narrowed her eyes, then tapped a location on the map. Here. The chantry. Carver said. They built a chantry on top of a magister's cage. I'm not sure cage is the right word. Morrigan flipped through a ledger. Blood mages and harrowing deaths significantly higher than anywhere else. Twice that of the Circle of Ostwick. Carver nodded slowly. And my brother is right in the thick of it all. He shook his head. This explains a lot. 'Twould be best to take care. Morrigan gestured. You've seen what a blood mage can do with a slashed wrist. Thousands were sacrificed every year in Kirkwall. Well. Shit. Nathaniel reached for his bow. What's the plan? Find it. Kill it. Jarath glanced down at the map. Worst case scenario? Ask everyone kindly to leave, then blow whatever part of the city is hiding it. All right, if we head in through. Carver hadn't finished the words when the chantry suddenly emitted a brilliant light and began to collapse in on itself. Maker's breath. Next to him, Jarath let out a string of curses that spanned 5 countries and several centuries. He ended it with, "That dragon-souled bitch." Sir. Nathaniel turned towards him. Jarath took a deep breath. Anders. Oh. Nathaniel glanced back at where the chantry had stood. Shit. Carver, I'd wager your brother is going to need some help. Get to him. And if he has to make a run for it. Jarath considered a moment. Remind Isabella about your cousin Lenore. Braska can help. I'll find you after. Yes, sir. Carver headed into the city. Nathaniel, back him. Jarath turned. Temarin, head back, tell Morrigan what happened. We may need her to open doors. Yes, Ser. Loghain, with me. His brother was, as expected, right in the thick of things. If he'd heard correctly, the Knight Commander had invoked the right of annulment, and Gabriel was on his way to defend the mages. And Merrill was with him. Carver slew a demon, then walked towards his brother. A group of guards and Templars were fighting a losing battle against demons. Jarath glanced over his shoulder to make sure Loghain's helmet was secure, then adjusted his own to hide his face. He called the Fade to cloak him, and moved in, Loghain a step behind. They slew the demons, and moved on before the guards and Templars could ask questions. Across the bay, the gallows was lit up by spells being cast everywhere. Think they stand a chance? Loghain asked. Carver and Nathaniel are there and fighting. Jarath took a breath. Anything on that island is contained for now. Focus on the demons. Did the explosion do the trick? Can't you feel it? Jarath asked. The whole city is. He shook his head. Looser. The air isn't biting. Loghain tilted his head to one side, then he nodded. So this is why you didn't recall Anders. If I'd known this. He spun, and drove his sword through a shade. When we are done here, there are some questions that need to be answered. Loghain glanced over the gallows. It's quiet. Head back. Regroup with Nathaniel. Jarath sheathed his weapons. Where are you going? Unfinished business. Carver followed his brother onto the boat. Isabella started to walk towards Gabriel, and Carver caught her wrist. They are going to be hunting him. She sighed. And he's fairly well known. Maybe Lenore knows something? You can find her, yes. Oh, that's a brilliant idea. Yes, she'd be able to help. He left her to set the course, then went to where Merrill was standing. She leaned into him. We did the right thing, didn't we? She asked. I don't think there was a right thing back there. He put his arms around her. But I know I'll be able to look at my reflection without feeling ill, and I suppose that's the best we can do. What happens now? Dinner. Maybe a glass of wine. We'll take the rest as it comes. The man he was looking for was walking out of the city alone. Jiroth waited until he was completely outside of the city, then intercepted his path. Excuse. Anders stared. Commander. Shock filled the man's features. Anders. Jiroth narrowed his eyes. We need to have a chat. You're alive. As are you. It remains to be seen if that's going to continue. Jiroth met the man's eyes. Why? Anders blinked. It took him a moment to process the question, and then he shook his head. You said it, back at the vigil. There is no compromise when people are dying. Anders gestured. The mages have to stand now, or be killed. Damn it, Anders. Jiroth shook his head. How many died today? The chantry failed its duty. Anders' eyes began glowing. Justice. Commander. Do you think what you did was right? Innocents were being harmed, and mages enslaved. Yes. I can prove you wrong with 4 words. Commander, I. Aura joined the chantry. The glow vanished from Anders' eyes, and the man staggered. What? He shook his head. What did you say to him? I told him the truth. That the 2 of you just murdered Kristoff's wife. But. Anders turned back towards the city. You should have come to me, Anders. Jiroth shook his head. I know you were trying to help justice. You should have come to me. I killed them, Jiroth. Wardens. I became an abomination. You can't know. Jiroth caught Anders' shoulder, and forced the larger man to meet his eyes. And what lay behind them? He heard Anders gasp. As it happens, I do know. He let the other man go. Choose. Commander. Which shall I be today, Anders? Justice? Or vengeance? Anders swallowed, then looked back at the city. I killed Aura. Betrayed Hawk. Betrayed you. He sighed. Vengeance. Then follow. We've work yet to do. Sir. What better revenge could there be, Anders, than letting you live with yourself? He shook his head. What worse punishment exists than redemption? He met Anders' eyes. It's time for you to come home. News had traveled. They reached Ostwick only to learn the circle there was already rumbling. Most of the group remained on the boat while Isabella led Carver and Gabriel to the chapter house. Fenris refused to leave Gabriel's side. A dwarf met them at the door. Isabella. She gave him a relieved look. Broska. I need a favor. Broska started to nod, then his head came up sharply. He narrowed his eyes at Gabriel. Hawk, I presume. Carver reminded himself that Jiroth wouldn't have sent them to someone who'd turn them in. He gave Fenris a reassuring look. Gabriel nodded. Isabella says you are one of the few people she trusts. And Zev says you and yours helped him out of a jam. What can I do for you? Gabriel sighed, and shook his head. Seems we need to get out of the free marches. Fortunately, Antova is beautiful this time of year. Broska stepped back to allow them inside. He had to give Broska credit. In 3 days, he and Varric had completely overhauled everything Hawk. Just a few years ago, he'd have been staggered by the amount of money that had been shifted around. I wish you could stay with us, Lenore said. She ruffled Sala's hair. It's wonderful having family around, but this is one of the first place they'd look. Bet Songbird is already on his way, Broska muttered. Songbird? Gabriel asked, raising an eyebrow. Aye. Broska closed a ledger. He's a good guy, don't get me wrong, but these days he's more the left hand of the divine than Warden Constable. He'll be apologetic about it, but he will turn ya in. And I like you, Hawk, I really do, but I ain't gonna bash him in the head for ya. I wouldn't ask you to. You've done far more than we had any right to ask. Keep in touch. Lenore asked. We will. He'd made his farewells and was on his way to where Jiroth had suggested they meet when he realized he was being followed. He turned, and saw Meryl, staff in hand and pack slung over her shoulder. Meryl. I'm going with you. You. She shook her head. Don't argue. She caught his hand. It won't do you any good, anyway. Meryl, what we are doing, it's not safe. And Kirkwall was. She shook her head. I've lost too much, Carver. What we have. I'm not losing it too. I'm coming with you. I can help. He kissed her. It's all right, bringing her in. Carver raised an eyebrow at Jarath. Do you trust her? Jarath folded his arms. Yes. Carver nodded. Yes, I do. Good enough for me? Jarath shrugged. Though you might want to warn her Anders is here ahead of time. Might be some. He twitched a shoulder. Hard feelings. Carver nodded. Yeah, I can imagine. He took a deep breath. That son of a bitch ruined my brother's life. And he'll be spending the rest of his life making up for it. Jarath's eyes narrowed. Him and Justice both. Carver flinched as he heard Justice's voice take over Anders. Maybe using his Templar abilities around the mage hadn't been the best idea. Justice started to summon magic, and then another form was there, carved of green stone. Vigilance crashed into Anders, and both the spirit and the glow surrounding Anders vanished. Anders fell to the ground, apparently unconscious. Carver blinked. What just happened? Anders went crazy and fell down. Meryl raised an eyebrow. Then she frowned. Again. I think Vigilance has decided to have a few words with Justice. Nathaniel shrugged. Which may not end well for Justice. Words. Meryl raised an eyebrow at Carver. Vigilance has very definite opinions about possessing people. Carver nodded to her. He's actually possessed all of us at one point or another, when we needed a little extra help. He. Meryl stared. What? He never takes control. He just gives us an edge. Tamarin was hurt once, bad. He wasn't going to make it, didn't have enough energy left. Carver glanced at the unconscious Anders. That was the first time Vigilance possessed one of us. He kept Tamarin up and going and got him back to us, then left him again. When you say. Meryl tilted her head up at him. He possessed you. I got hit with an enchantment. All of a sudden, I couldn't see, and there were enemies around. Next thing I knew, Vigilance was there, and he joined me, letting me use his senses. He's. Carver smiled. He's our friend, and we trust him. And we all share the same purpose. We're wardens. Oh. Meryl trailed off as Anders started to come back to consciousness. Anders, you all right? The mage blinked, and shook his head slightly as if dazed. He accepted Nathaniel's hand up. That. He swallowed. Was disconcerting. What happened? Vigilance. Anders took a deep breath. Just made it clear in no uncertain terms that he will not tolerate Justice threatening any of his people. Anders frowned slightly. And that he counts wresting control as a threat to me. Like I said. Carver put his arm around Meryl's waist. Vigilance has very definite opinions. He smiled. And a hell of a punch. Chapter 7, Most Fluffy. Danya stared down at the parcel. The dwarven runes on it burned into her eyes. Another letter to her father, rejected. She tossed a tool onto the workbench and sat, folding her arms over her knees and burying her head in them, weeping. A moment later, she felt the sensation of someone sitting beside her, and the warmth of an arm going across her shoulders. The spirit sat with her, a quiet and protective presence, until she fell asleep. Can I join? Jarath looked up at Meryl. You have joined. No, that's not. Meryl shook her head. I meant the wardens. I could help, when you go on your darkspawn hunting trips. He rose from where he'd been examining a map, and met her eyes levelly. No. But. 1. You would not survive the joining. He shook his head. That is no dishonor on you, nor a suggestion of weakness. Many good and strong people do not survive. 2. You are of far more use here, helping Morrigan and Danya and studying the Elovians. 3. you have joined. As far as I am concerned, you are one of us already. Meryl nodded. I just want to help. He smiled at her. I know. You do realize that my doing so in no way makes it legal, yes? Loghain raised an eyebrow. It's not exactly like we are good Chantry folks. Carver shrugged, and pulled Meryl in closer. And you performed the ceremony for the commander. He folded his arms. That one wasn't legal either. And they don't care any more than we do. Carver grinned. Please. Meryl smiled up at him. Despite himself, Loghain returned the smile. Only if you tell the others first. I am not risking Danya's wrath if I perform a wedding ceremony without her getting the chance to fuss over the bride. He shook his head. I have no desire to see just how many colors of fire she could set me on. They thanked him, and left the room. He watched them leave, leaning against the wall. Well. He turned at the sound of the other man's voice, and saw Jarath shrug. You did say you wanted grandkids. Loghain actually laughed. True enough. Jarath watched as Morrigan walked Kirin through the motions of the spell. She was halfway through when her instruction ceased to be necessary and Kirin began intoning the enchantment on his own. Veil fire gleamed on the surface of the table, dancing in various shapes. Kirin focused his magic, and the veil fire took the shape of a mulberry that pranced across the table. The boy laughed, and lost his concentration. The green flames vanished. Kirin sighed, and then caught sight of him. Father, did you see? He pointed. I saw. Jarath caught the boy when Kirin rushed towards him, lifting him up and setting him on his hip. He felt a pang when he realized he wasn't going to be able to do that for much longer. A few more years, and Kirin would be taller than he was. A mulberry. Grandpa Loghain says he'll get me one, but they are hard to find in Orlais. Kirin smiled. He says it's because Orlesians don't like dogs smarter than they are. Yes, that definitely sounds like something your Grandpa Loghain would say. Jarath nodded. Kirin tilted his head at him. You got Anders a kitten. I did. It makes it home again, for him. Kirin nodded. I hope so. He shifted his son until Kirin was on his back, and then carried him towards where the others were starting to gather for the evening meal. Divine Lollipop is not a suitable name. Anders shook his head, and looked down at the ball of calico fluff he was holding. Is it? He asked the kitten. It's a perfect name. Danya folded her arms and grinned up at him. Right. She glanced at Meryl. It suits her. Meryl nodded at the dwarf. Look at her, she's the most fluffy. It's undignified. Anders glared at them. Nathaniel stared at him. Your last two cats were Mr. Wiggums and Sir Pounce-a-Lot. Commander. Anders turned to stare beseechingly. There is no force in Thedas that could make me take part in this conversation. A word. Nathaniel glanced at Jarath. In private. Jarath shrugged, and gestured for Nathaniel to follow him. What's wrong? He asked when they'd reached the remains of what had been a tower. You ask as if you didn't already know, and weren't aware that I know that. Nathaniel shook his head. Which makes no more sense than the rest of it. He folded his arms. That wasn't the first time I've reacted to your orders before you've spoken them aloud, just the first time someone called it out. He'd been shocked by Carver's words, shocked more by the realization they were right. Jarath hadn't actually given him the order yet. And there is more. You always know where I am. Jarath nodded. Is that why you sent me to the Free Marches? Because you knew you could always find me. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. No. I sent you to the Free Marches because you're the best spy I have. The other part was purely a bonus. Jarath shook his head. Does this? Nathaniel swallowed. Does this have anything to do with the architect and? It might. Jarath. Nathaniel met his eyes. I need to know what happened. Jarath leaned back against the wall, and returned the look. I let Velena use blood magic on you. The alternative was you dying. Nathaniel slowly nodded. Blood magic. When you were brought back to the cell and regained consciousness you started screaming. Trying to claw out your own eyes, fighting. Jiroth nodded. Vilena used blood magic to take away your memories of what occurred, whatever it was the architect did to you. Except whatever it was, he did the same thing to you. Nathaniel let his arms drop to his sides. And you remember? I remember. That doesn't mean I can make sense of any of it. But. He shrugged. I always know where you are. If I concentrate a little, I can also determine what condition you are in, even pick up on your mood. And if it's directed at me already. Nathaniel looked down. I can hear your thoughts. Morrigan. Jiroth took a deep breath. Has a theory. Not sure how I feel about it. She thinks. He twitched a shoulder. She thinks whatever the architect was doing, he was using a spirit or a demon as part of it. And that something of that remains in each of us, a small part of what was once one soul. Forming a link. Nathaniel frowned. And between you and Morrigan. Picked that up, did you? Jiroth raised an eyebrow. No, that's something else. Her magic. Well, whatever this is. Nathaniel squared his shoulders. It could be of considerably more use than it is currently. We should. He shook his head. You spared Vilena and brought her into the Wardens because she saved my life. Yes. We can use this. We just need to figure out how it works. Nathaniel nodded. And? Nathaniel shook his head. Maybe how to block it out, cause I'm not sure I need you knowing. About that blonde in Rialto, or the brunette in Wildervale. Jiroth shook his head. I don't need a link for that. He rolled his eyes. I have Carver. 'Tis growing worse by the day. Morrigan gestured at the map. And not all of it by happenstance, Loghain said. Jiroth sighed. Orlays is rumbling. He shook his head. We need to get someone into the Imperial Court. Without information, we're stuck. I'm fresh out of Orlshion spies, Nathaniel said. Unless you want to try making contact with Bruhan. No. Jiroth shook his head. His first loyalty hasn't been to the Wardens in a long time. You aren't an option, Carver, and I will be dragged to Sedita kicking and screaming, Anders will be executed, Meryl won't get in the front door, Danya keeps getting distracted by shiny things, Temerin is one of the worst liars I've ever met, and Loghain. Nathaniel shook his head. Heh. That leaves me, Morrigan said. They blinked and looked at her. She laughed. 'Tis a nest of vipers, is it not? I will fit right in. Bruhan and Leliana will recognize you as well, Jiroth said. Let them. Morrigan shrugged. They know only that I callously abandoned you just after the Battle of Denerim. They will not like me, but they will not suspect me, and their concern is Chantry, not court. He kissed her. Try to leave Valroio standing, my love. He felt the dream start to shift. For a moment, he considered holding it firm, letting her come to him instead. Then he sighed, and let her take the reins. Flemeth. You've recovered your missing mage, I see. Why just kill a Magister when you can kill a Magister and start a war? He shook his head. A lovely little mess. It was necessary, lad, and for now that is all you need to know. They gestured at a map. You need to go to the Anderfells. She pointed. Here. A little close to Weishaupt, for my tastes. Which is exactly why you must go. And I am not asking a favor here, boy. You can decide not to do this. But I think you will find the results worthwhile. You are seeking the Red Bride's grave. Why not just tell me about the Magister? Jiroth shook his head. Why the games? Some things must happen a certain way. Like you gambling with the lives of my friends to ensure that one day, you and I would be here, having this very conversation. She laughed. There are many places we could hold this conversation, and many ways this conversation could go. But yes. You always intended to save them. As you said, you could not have done what was necessary without them. She shrugged. Or, perhaps more accurately, you would not have done it. Flemeth inclined her head, then shifted out of the dream. He shook his head, then did the same thing. Jiroth could sense only one warden in the cavern. He and Carver moved through, dealing with the corpses that were slowly rising again. They had just finished taking down the last when a small band emerged. An elf in warden armor stepped to the front of the elven mage defensively, followed a moment later by a woman in Templar armor. "Who are you?" the elf asked. "Wardens, as you can tell," Jiroth replied. "You." "I'm Carinal," he said. He gestured. "These others are recruits." He glanced down at the bodies. "We didn't realize anyone knew where we were. Thank you for the help." "Maker's breath!" Carver exclaimed. Jiroth glanced to see what had startled the man. A head had popped up from the basket being carried by the mage. A beaked head. Jiroth turned to look back at Carinal. The young man was staring at him. I know you." His eyes suddenly widened. "You're the warden. The one that killed the archdemon." "I am." He nodded at the basket. "And somehow, against all odds, you have griffins." "Yes," the elven mage said. He smiled. "Let's get those to safety, then." "We have to protect them," Valia said. She paced the garden. "From everyone. This is the only second chance we are going to get." "I am not arguing with you," Jiroth said. "I'm telling you Icehopt is not the place for them. Not now. And you are the one to decide that." Riemaz folded her arms. "I walked through a tree and brought you to a garden hidden behind a mirror," Jiroth said. "I think I've adequately demonstrated I know a few things you don't." Valia shook her head and laughed. "Fair point. I can keep them, and you, safe. Along with your companions." Jiroth glanced over his shoulder at Carver. "And as it happens, I know just the person to help. It's as worded as I can make it, Commander." Danya squared her shoulders. She glanced at Valia. "I'm going to want all the shed feathers." "We can arrange that." Valia nodded. "With 3 mages to look after them, they should be fine." Riemaz petted one of the creatures. Jiroth glanced over to where Meryl was sitting, a griffin in her lap. If the Dalish girl smiled any wider, the top of her head was going to fall off. "No one can get in here to you without the key, and we are the only ones that have that." Carinal nodded. "I'd say no safer place in Thedas, but I'm not sure we are actually in Thedas." Chapter 8, Seaharan. Seaharan. Nathaniel shook his head. "Why don't we just let the Qunari take this one? Do we trust the Qunari to do the logical thing?" Jiroth raised an eyebrow. "That's..." Nathaniel sighed. "A very good point, actually." Temarin gestured at the map. "There are dwarven ruins on Seaharan. Old tags, some of them abandoned before the first blight really got going." He shrugged. "Not a lot of spawn on the island though. An advantage of being an island. Do we even have a path there?" "None we can travel safely." Jiroth sighed. "Like it or not, we are going to have to take the long way. We can take ship in Carinus. You do remember that you are an elf, right?" Jiroth blinked at Nathaniel, then slowly raised a hand to touch one of his ears. "Huh. When did that happen?" Nathaniel rolled his eyes. "Do you think these Venuwutsits know about this?" "It's a strong possibility, but they've got to fight through Qunari to get there." Jiroth glanced down at the map again. "Like we don't." Nathaniel shrugged. "We aren't Tevinter, and aren't there to annoy the Qunari." Jiroth shrugged. "We behave ourselves, we should be limited to having to fight demons and primordial darkspawn." "Oh. Good." The messenger had activated one of Danya's devices. Danya looked at it critically. "Think the architect wants to talk to you?" Jiroth twitched a shoulder. "Only one way to find out." "That's the signal for the wilds, yes." "Yep. Tell the others I'll meet them in Carinus." "Messenger." "Warden Commander." The Darkspawn gestured. "We are having a problem." "Darkspawn?" "No." The messenger shook his head. "Demons. And undead. Strange magics." Jiroth frowned. "Unfortunately, there isn't a lot we can do right now. We've got trouble of our own." He narrowed his eyes. Get a message to Vigil's Keep. Either Setida or Sir Alex should be able to handle this one. I will be doing this. And don't let them give you any shit. Skyhunter, Sigrun, and Garavel can all vouch for you. Carver had to admit Anders did look a bit intimidating in the Tevinter-style robes. But no one looked twice at him or his entourage. Nathaniel arranged passage, and his Marcher accent went unquestioned. The voyage across the straits was uncomfortable, mostly because they couldn't talk freely. The paths through the Eluvian were uncomfortable to the non-elves, but they did save a lot of difficulty. Once they made landfall, they switched out their gear, and headed overland through the jungle. The fourth day was mostly an uphill climb. Anders shook his head. If only we had a giant rock to push uphill, this would perfectly sum up our lives. Keep complaining, and I'll find you one, Carver replied. Now, children. Nathaniel drawled. Who are you, and what are you doing here? The Qunari woman stared daggers at them. We are wardens, and we are investigating some ruins, Nathaniel replied. She relaxed slightly. I am Talsaad. She gestured. I am also investigating these ruins. Why are the wardens interested? Jarath stepped forward. Our research indicates something of interest may have been left there around the time of the first blight. Ordinarily, we would have come through official channels, but we learned that some Tevinter were on their way and time became pressing. Several wardens have proven themselves base Aladdin. She nodded slowly. You are here to prevent this from falling into Tevinter hands. We are. Will you swear not to draw your weapons on Qunari? They glanced at each other. Yes, Jarath told her. Then follow me, I will show you how to get inside. Talsaad and Temarin were quickly chatting like long-lost friends, pointing out various interesting details in the ruins to each other. Carver elbowed Nathaniel. Put your tongue back in your mouth. Nathaniel chuckled. Sorry. It's just. His eyes went back to Talsaad. That's a lot of women. Anders shook his head. She's Qunari. Carver can tell you about what happens when you get involved with Qunari women. He glanced over as Carver made a choking noise. What? I'll tell you later, Carver said. The Tevinter mage started to cast, and both Jarath and Carver sent out energy of their own. The mage had a moment for dumbfounded surprise before Nathaniel put an arrow into his eye. He may have gloated a bit prematurely, Talsaad said. If there is one, there are more. Temarin glanced down at the body. How did they get here so fast? They likely hired Talvashoth to get them through. Jarath glanced back over his shoulder. Longtooth, Junior, Blondie, guard Thinker and Talsaad while they get the door open. I'll deal with our new friends. Talsaad joined Temarin in working on the barrier door. She shook her head. Are you folks going to tell me who you really are? Well, we really are wardens, if that makes you feel better. Nathaniel knocked an arrow. I'll take what I can get at the moment. Carver sent out another wave of energy as the emissary-like thing started to gather in a spell. Nathaniel sent 2 fire arrows into it before it could regroup. A few shades began to materialize. Temarin drew his hammers. Oh, lovely. Talsaad drew her long knives. Katara, Bass. She moved in to attack one of the shades. Anders focused his magic on a pride demon that materialized, keeping the massive creature away from the others. Nathaniel focused his arrows on the demons as Carver closed in with the Magister. Its barrier blocked his arrows, but did nothing against the Templar-trained man's great sword. The battle itself lasted only a few moments. Which one was that? Nathaniel asked as he saw Temarin examining the runes. Priest of Earthamiel, as near as I can make out. The dwarf shook his head. We should seal this chamber. Talsaad sighed. I hate the thought of all the potential knowledge here being lost. I hate even more the notion of it falling into the wrong hands. Nathaniel gave her a commiserating look. On the bright side, the rest of the ruins will be a lot safer for you to explore. She nodded. I started this expedition thinking I'd be lucky to find some bits of pottery. This is. She shrugged. Who are you people? Suddenly she blinked. Oh, your friend. We should go help him. Carver smirked. If he needs help, we're all screwed. You stabbed a Tal Vashoth with his own horns. Nathaniel slowly shook his head. I really don't know why I'm surprised by that. Tal Vashoth usually cut off their horns. Jarath gestured. And I promised her I wouldn't draw weapons on any Qunari. He shrugged. Tal Saad sighed. If they were working with Vince, they weren't Qunari. She narrowed her eyes at the 4 surrendered mercenaries who were sitting quietly by the tree, well away from their weapons. Have you questioned them? I doubt they have information that would interest us. They are yours, if you want them. I don't, but I should take them to the Vidaithlok. She looked around. What about the Vince? There were only a half-dozen. They declined the option to surrender. He narrowed his eyes. They babbled something about the Elder One. Mean anything to you? She shook her head. Commander. Temarin glanced at Jarath. We're done here. Tal Saad caught up with them 2 days later. Wait. I thought you were heading to the Vidaithlok. I did. She shook her head. Turned over the prisoners, but... She glanced over her shoulder. That was more than just killing some old darkspawn. They exchanged looks. Jarath shrugged. It was. All that Amasrans know is some Vince were interested in old ruins and I called on some wardens to help me with the darkspawn. But... She glanced at them. I'll keep your secrets. I swear it. Please. I need to know. He gave her a considering look. Finally, he nodded. You know the story of how the Blights began. Tevinter Magisters broke into the world of demons. What we killed back there was one of those Magisters. She closed her eyes for a moment. And that's what you're doing. Finding them. Killing them. Saving the world, Nathaniel said. I've been. She spread her hands. I've been researching my entire life. It is my role. My purpose. Let me help you. You can help us best by going back to the ruins and seeing what else you can find. Jarath reached into his belt pouch and pulled out one of Danya's devices. You can activate this with fire. The flame from a candle will do the trick. If you find anything, activate it, and one of us will be to you as soon as we can. He held it out. Tal Saad, you cannot tell anyone about this. Not even other Qunari. I know. But if I don't help. She took the device. The Qunari will be in as much danger as anyone else. Carver filled Loghain in on what they had found, doing a mocking imitation that he claimed was Nathaniel staring at Tal Saad. Temarin's laughter died when he saw Jarath enter the room. Bad news from the messenger. Jarath nodded. Orliv, Emery, and Keenan are dead. Oh shit. What happened? He filled them in. Carver sighed. I'm sorry about your sister. Her response to me having the sniffles was to bind a rage demon and stick it in my head. He rolled his shoulders tiredly. I suppose her not being a psychopath was a bit too much to hope. Nathaniel sighed. I think the worst part about this mission of ours is knowing that our friends are still out there, fighting their own battles. He walked to the sideboard, and poured drinks. Tea for Jarath, wine for the others. And possibly losing them. He handed around the drinks. To Orliv, and his terrible jokes. Carver lifted his glass. To Emery, a Templar who wasn't an asshole. To Keenan, an Orlshian who actually knew what honor meant. Loghain lifted his own glass. To the men and women of the Vigil, the crazy bastards. Temarin lifted his glass. To fallen brothers, and those that still stand. Anders added his glass. In peace, vigilance. In war, victory. In death, sacrifice. Jarath lifted his glass, and then they all drank. Chapter 9, Red Lyrium. Carver read over the letter from his brother, and went to find the commander. Jarath was sparring with Anders. Carver tilted his head to one side. The mage's eyes were glowing. So he was sparring with Justice. He waited a few minutes until they'd finished the bout. Carver. I got a letter from my brother. He held up the parchment. He got a letter from Avellini. It seems there have been a couple other incidents with red lyrium in Kirkwall. He wants my help in researching it. Jiroth nodded. It's certainly a matter worth looking into. He twitched a shoulder. But the only one who might have access to the necessary information is Loghain. Think your brother would be up for working with him? Carver shrugged. Gabriel yes, Avellini no. But Gabriel will be the one making contact, and despite all evidence to the contrary, he's not an idiot. Where do you want Loghain to meet you? Jader. I'll let him know. Anders hesitated, then followed Carver out of the room. Carver narrowed his eyes when he noticed. What? Anders sighed. How is he? He's working with Lenore. Smuggling mages out of bad situations. Carver shrugged. That? Anders shook his head. That isn't what I meant. I know what you meant. But I think you forfeited your right to be at all involved in my brother's life. Carver folded his arms. Anders swallowed. No. You're right. He couldn't bring himself to meet Carver's eyes. I just wanted to know if they're okay. Is Saladesh? He cut off as Carver caught him by the throat and slammed him into the wall. You used him. You ruined his life, took away everything he built. They had to go on the run because of you. And now you pretend to care. Carver glared. I do care, Carver. Anders couldn't quite bring himself to meet the other man's eyes. He bowed his head. You're right. He was quite possibly the best friend I ever had, and I repaid that by betraying him. I can never ask him to forgive me for that. He sighed. Carver let him go. They're alive. They're as safe as hawks get. And they're together. More than that, you don't need to know. That's enough. Anders closed his eyes and took a deep breath. With effort, he made himself look up at Carver. Thank you. You're here. You're helping. That's enough that I won't kill you. Carver nodded. But even think about going anywhere near my brother or his family, and I will break every bone in your body, teeth included. He turned, and walked away. Gabriel was at a makeshift archery field, helping Sala with her staff work. Carver stopped, and watched for a few minutes. Despite not actually being related by blood, there was starting to be a clear family resemblance. Sala had adopted many of Gabriel's mannerisms, right down to that flashy little staff twirl thing he did. He felt the air behind him shift slightly, and turned to see Fenris. The elf lowered his blade. Sneaking up here is not a good idea. I wasn't sneaking. Carver shrugged. He turned back to where his brother and niece were throwing ice at hay bales, and smiled. Just didn't want to interrupt. Fenris nodded. Good to see you. You got the letter. He gestured for Carver to walk with him towards the small keep. The place had been built with an eye for defense, but someone had been putting effort into making it cheerful. And it smelled of gingerbread. The source of the smell became apparent as Orana stepped out of the kitchen. She blinked when she recognized Carver, and the next thing he knew he was in a chair, being fed pastries and fretted over. Caleb sat his lap harp down and began badgering him for stories. A wide smile appeared on Gabriel's face when he entered and saw Carver sitting there. Carver. Gabriel. He held up a pastry. I'm stealing Orana when I leave. Over my dead body. Gabriel grinned, and accepted the pastry Orana handed him before going to fuss over Sala. His expression became slightly more serious. You got my letter. Have you found anything? Carver shook his head. Nathaniel and I are on the move most of the time. But I have someone who can help. Up for a trip to Jader. Fenris. Gabriel put a hand on his lover's shoulder. Some sea air could do us good. Fenris put his arm around Gabriel's waist. How is Meryl? Gabriel raised an eyebrow. Carver smiled. Enraptured with her work. She's been researching elven magical techniques for us. It wasn't all that far from the truth. Valia had shared the diary with Meryl, and the two of them had been putting their heads together to duplicate and improve some trick with landships. At least, when they weren't helping Danya and Morrigan rewrite the fundamental laws of reality or treating griffins like pampered lap pets. The largest of the beasts currently weighed about 500 pounds and was showing no signs of stopping its growth anytime soon. He'd wager by the time they reached full size, he could ride one in full armor. And you two are getting along well? Gabriel raised an eyebrow as he leaned on the ship railing. She hasn't turned me into a frog yet. I consider that a good sign. She had a griffin, and was able to research Eluvians from inside one. These days, just being within 20 feet of Meryl could put anyone in a good mood. He thought about telling Gabriel that he'd married Meryl, but it occurred to him that telling Gabriel he'd gotten married without inviting him to the wedding was a good way to spend the rest of the trip frozen in a block of ice. So, Fenris, you going to make an honest man out of my brother? Then who would Varric go drinking with? Fenris raised an eyebrow. Good point. Carver laughed. Gabriel and Fenris followed him to the tavern out of town. He could sense the presence of another warden nearby, and requested the use of the private dining room. The innkeeper nodded, and accepted the coins. Fenris entered the room first, glancing this way and that before continuing forward so Gabriel could enter. Carver had left his warden armor in his pack. He gestured for them to sit, and paid the innkeeper to bring them food for 4, and a bottle of Antivan brandy. He watched his brother's jaw drop when Loghain entered the room. Fenris raised an eyebrow in confusion. Gabriel shook his head. If I'd taken a pool on who'd walk through that door, I think Divine Justina might have come in at better odds. Carver chuckled. Loghain, this my brother, Gabriel Hawke, and this is Fenris. Gabriel, Fenris, this is Senior Warden Loghain MacTier. Gabriel rose and held out a hand. You're slightly less ogre-looking than I'd pictured. I could say the same for you, Loghain said, accepting the handshake. Carver tells me you have some questions. You are going to keep safe, right? Gabriel shook his head and smiled. You do recall that I'm the elder, overprotective brother, yes. You are also the one being actively hunted. Carver shrugged. We set up a couple drops. You and Loghain will be able to stay in touch without anyone realizing. You trust him? Gabriel raised an eyebrow. I do. Carver twitched a shoulder. Well, with your life, anyway. He easily dodged the kick Gabriel directed at him. Loghain parried Jarotha's blow, and tried a strike with his shield. It didn't land. But then, it never did. It couldn't have been an accident. A random earthquake takes out all of Ferelden's best. Jaroth shook his head. No. Our lives just don't work that way. You cannot blame yourself, Jaroth. I painted the targets on them. Jaroth crouched and sent a sweeping kick at Loghain's legs. Loghain leaped back to avoid it. But you are right. The blame lies with whoever set them up. He came in with an overhand blow, trying to take advantage of the elf's off position. Jaroth simply rolled to the side and then came up behind him, pressing the point of his blade against Loghain's side. They stepped back, bowed, and continued. Claral has recalled the Ferelden wardens to Orlais. None left at the vigil have sufficient rank to ignore the order. He feinted with the shield, and managed to tag Jaroth on the leg. How goes your work with Carver's brother? I've found only one other reference to Red Lyrium, and it mentioned only seeing mention of Red Lyrium in a document that dated back to the first Blight. I've had no luck finding the original document. Orlais has little in original sources before the second Blight, and many of the earlier documents are difficult to decipher. He stepped back. It's the rumors of Corypheus that concern me more. On that we can agree. If it is the same creature. Jaroth set the practice blades down. We've killed 3 other Magisters. None of those have returned. Temerin had a theory there. Right. And it makes sense. Corypheus himself killed another Magister, and is the reason the architect's head got messed with. Naturally he'd be more powerful. There is another matter. The calling. Nearly a third have reported hearing it thus far. I think the number is closer to half, but many are not admitting it. Claral is worried. You aren't hearing it. Loghain shook his head. I'm past 60, Jaroth. And boys who had their joining only a few months ago are hearing it. He narrowed his eyes. Unless you are the reason I'm not. I acknowledge the possibility. Jiroth sighed. Keep a close watch on Clairol. He tilted his head to one side. Morning is approaching. Tell everyone I said hello. I will. Wake up. He sat up in his bed, and put his feet onto the floor. A night spent sparring and talking in the Fade wasn't quite as restful as real sleep, but better for the soul in its way. Loghain walked to the nightstand and splashed some water on his face. He went still. Corypheus had managed to call to wardens before, affected Janka and Anders. What if he were behind what was happening now? He knew the words were a mistake the moment he said them. But then, he was used to a commander who actually listened when asking for advice. Clairol narrowed her eyes. Thank you for your opinion, Loghain. Return to your... Her eyes narrowed. Duties. He nodded, and left quickly. Rather than return to the library, he headed out to the ramparts. Fresh air was better for thinking than dust and cobwebs. The view from the North Tower showed the spread of Monte Isambard in the distance. Naturally, he preferred the view from the South Tower. After a few minutes, he was about to head back inside. He felt something. Run. The voice sounded almost like Jiroth's. They are coming for you. Run. Suddenly he knew. The spirit. He went over the side of the tower, climbed down the stone wall, and ran. Chapter 10, Siralt. Carver pulled the hood of his cloak down as he entered the tavern. By now, Lady Morrigan was already at the castle. He just needed to find a way in for himself. Once he got the lay of the land, he could simply report a darkspawn sighting. He was about to reach for his map when someone sat down across from him. Well now, what brings a warden here? Heard a rumor of a darkspawn sighting. Thought it best to be safe. Carver shrugged as he looked at the newcomer. The man was dressed in fine clothing for someone who didn't bother with a mask. Your accent. The newcomer tilted his head. Fereldan. When Carver nodded, the other man smiled with delight. A Fereldan Grey Warden, here in Siralt. Do you have a name? They'd discussed this. Carver Hawk was wanted by the wardens, but he doubted any not a warden knew that. The commander said to use his judgment. Carver nodded. Carver. Carver Hawk. The other man's eyes widened. Leon de Vere. He clapped once, before rising. Come, I'd wager I can find us a far more delightful repast this evening. He caught Carver's cloak in one hand, and Carver found himself being nearly dragged out of the tavern. An hour later Leon was leading him through the front doors of the castle and directly into the main hall, and straight up to none other than the Marquis himself. Present for you, he chirped, throwing his arm around Carver's shoulders. Found him in a tavern. If he's who he says he is, he might be useful. And if he isn't, well, he might be even more useful. Carver blinked, then bowed. Carver Hawk, your grace. Brother to the other Hawk. You know the one. Champion of Kirkwall. Slayer of Cunnery. Pain in my arse. At your service. The Marquis gave him an appraising look. Carver had been told the man was a scholar, and had expected a bleary-eyed fellow. This man's eyes were sharp, and his face stern. Greetings, Warden. There was a trace of wariness in the voice. An honor, your grace. Carver tried to make his voice reassuring. Don't worry, I'm not here recruiting. I've business elsewhere, but I could do with a roof over my head and a warm meal for once. I can pay for my board with news of the places I've passed through, or, reluctantly, with tales about the antics of my sibling, who has more fame than I do, though less sense. The Marquis smiled, transforming the stern countenance into one of a friendly young man much the same age as Carver himself. It would be nice to have a few stories over the course of a meal that aren't outrageous lies. He winked at Leon. Leon put a hand over his heart. I'm hurt, your grace. The meal was the best he'd had in. Actually, the meal was probably the best he'd ever had. The Marquis was sharp, and did probe gently for information. Carver was fairly sure he'd let slip a bit more than he'd intended, but the seeds were planted. He found himself enjoying the company of the Marquis and Leon, despite Leon outright admitting that he was a bard. The Marquis's bodyguard said not a word the entire evening, yet somehow managed to be part of the conversation. He saw Morrigan in passing the next day, and they played the role of unfamiliar strangers. Morrigan actually turned up her nose at him as though he smelled unpleasant. He gave her a sneer of his own. While the Marquis was occupied with telling Morrigan about Sir Alt's shame, Carver managed to get a few words with the elven servant accompanying Morrigan. "I wasn't expecting an invitation right into the castle," Carver said. "It's going to limit my movements." Jiroth nodded. "The Marquis seems to like you. Stick close to him, maybe he'll tell you more than he has Morrigan." He sighed. "The Divine herself may be on her way here. We need to be long gone before she arrives. What if she sends Leliana on ahead? Leliana and Cassandra are on their way to Ferelden to talk to Bruhan. I believe they are then going to try to track down your brother. That should keep them occupied for a good while. Is Gabriel in trouble?" "No more than usual." The next morning the Marquis invited him to go hunting. They left well before dawn. Despite the Marquis's tendency to stop and talk to everyone they passed, they did eventually manage to bring down a boar. "You look a bit surprised at our victory, Warden Carver." Carver shrugged. "I asked about you before coming to Sir Alt to investigate that sighting. They told me you were a scholar who studiously avoided fencing lessons and other physical activities, Your Grace." Marquis Elrondil laughed. "Close enough to truth, I suppose. In the city, they tell me of fashion and cuisine. But out here," he gestured at the shack they'd passed earlier, "they tell me of trail signs and plants. From you, I would like to learn something of the Darkspawn." He nodded, and began describing the different kinds. The Marquis asked questions with an interest that seemed casual right up until Carver realized he'd just told the Marquis about the architect. He caught himself, then swallowed. "So what does actually bring you to Sir Alt, Sir Carver?" Carver glanced over his shoulder, and realized that at some point, the Marquis's bodyguard had taken up a position behind him. "Rumors, Your Grace. As I said. And yet, despite how many I've spoken to, none of these rumors of Darkspawn have reached my ears. Odd then, that the rumors would reach to the Free Marches. Stories grow and change in the telling, Your Grace. A group of 3 Qunari and a dragon once became a dozen ogres and a bear by the time the teller reached Vigil's Keep. True enough, I suppose." The Marquis smiled. "I trust you are finding your accommodations pleasant." "Yes, Your Grace." "Marvelous. Then there will be no need for you to leave the castle anytime soon." The guards that accompanied him as he walked about the castle managed to give the illusion that they were simply there as a friendly courtesy. They did, however, make reporting the situation to Jiroth rather impossible. He saw Jiroth note the guards, and that night he was pulled into the Fade. What happened? Sir Alt may be the ass end of Orlais, but the Marquis plays a good game. Carver sighed. "I let too much slip. I don't think he knows about you and Morrigan, but he knows I'm here for some ulterior reason. He's not pushing the issue, yet, but I'm not to leave the castle." Jiroth sighed. "He's been asking Morrigan questions as well. She's got the advantage of the Empress's writ, and so can afford to be unfriendly, but I fear she may have let a few things slip as well." He shook his head. "Hold your course for now." Leon was absent from the evening meal. The Marquis remained the same friendly fellow he'd been when Carver first arrived, but Carver tried to remain wary anyway. It was a bit more difficult than he anticipated. He really did like the Marquis. "Where is your bard, this evening?" "Tracking a pair of errant youths in the woods." The Marquis refilled his glass. "Seems they annoyed our dashing outlaw, and she gave them to some power in the forest. Leon has gone to see if he cannot make sense of it and perhaps retrieve them." "What power in the forest?" The Marquis raised an eyebrow. "You do not know? Interesting. If you tell me, perhaps I can assist." Quiet laughter answered his words. "Well, when Leon returns, we will both know the answer to this particular mystery." It was still early in the day when his presence was requested. The guard led Carver to the Marquis's office rather than to the main hall. Leon, it seemed, had returned, with a strange tale. The woods, it turns out, have their own court, a hall where the trees walk and the stones speak. Beasts congregate there like courtiers. I saw a wolf and a deer drinking water side by side from a silver bowl. The bard poured himself a healthy dollop of whiskey. A green knight rules there. He calls himself the Lord of the Forest, and you the Lord of Road and Field. Got horns growing from his helm. He's the one the dashing outlaw gave our errant siblings to. Uses them as cupbearers. They pour water for the beasts from golden jugs. He's done something to them. There was moss over their eyes and tongues. They don't speak any more. Did he speak? Marquis Elrondil asked. The horned knight was courteous enough. He says he's happy to release the siblings to you if, in return, you'll grant him a favor one day. Leon down the whiskey. Can't help but feel we've got rather more than we bargained for. Marquis Elrondil rose, and paced the small office. He glanced at Carver. Have you heard of such a thing before? Carver shrugged. Walking trees, yes. Sylvans are trees possessed by demons. The rest. He shook his head. Is this what brought you to my lands? No, your grace. Truth, please, Warden. Carver took a deep breath. This is not what brought me here, but it may spring from a similar source. He swallowed. Your ancestor did work for the Wardens, but the information regarding what, exactly, was done was destroyed in the chaos that followed the Blight. I was sent to see what I might uncover. And so my great-grandfather remains a thorn in my side. The Marquis leaned on his desk. The woods were wild and the veil there thin before he came about. He shook his head. Let the Lord of the Forest keep his little criminals, I will not indenture myself to some dark power on their behalf. A wise decision, your grace. Leon poured himself another glass. Twilight had claimed the land, and the main hall was empty of all save a few guards, the Marquis, Leon, and Carver. Carver was telling Leon the story he and Nathaniel joining forces with a small band of Qunari after a tall Vashoth had blown up part of a mine and released a group of dark spawn. With his blade broken, we thought the Ishid was done for, but then he grabbed a hurlock and started using it to bash the other dark spawn. The Marquis laughed. I can almost picture the look on the. He was cut off by the door bursting open. The man that strode into the hall was massive, and the horned helmet he wore made him look even larger. He wore armor of green, and his cloak appeared to be woven from ivy. A deer was slung over one of his shoulders, obviously dead, and he was dragging a hunter with him. He threw the hunter at the Marquis's feet. Carver glanced at the Marquis's bodyguard, and got a nod in return. Both moved to take up defensive positions, but the Marquis raised a calming hand. I seek justice. The massive man's deep voice echoed off the stones of the hall. Though I am Lord of the Forest, you are Lord of the Road and Field, and this man is yours. He slew my son. Grant me his life, and he will serve in my Heartwood court until I deem his debt has been repaid. The hunter was babbling, eyes wide with terror. A deer. I killed a deer. The horned knight caressed the creature slung over his shoulder. Just so. Marquis Elrondil stood, and walked towards the hunter. Where, perchance, did you kill this deer? In the. The hunter swallowed. In the deeps of the Applewood. My words forbidding such hunting were just empty wind. The Marquis's voice was sharper than the knight's, but rang from the stone just as well. Did you think I banned hunters from those glades without reason? Your grace, The Marquis stepped past the hunter, and met the horned knight's gaze levelly. Carver saw his bodyguard shift ever so slightly. The Marquis nodded to the knight. I apologize for your loss. This criminal is yours. The horned knight nodded gravely. I see that you are unlike your great-grandfather. He stepped forward, and grabbed the hunter. There is no shame in kindness. Let there be peace between us, and between field and forest. They could hear the hunter pleading as he was dragged away. The door slammed closed behind the horned knight. Leon flinched at the sound. The Marquis did not. I couldn't see anything under the helmet, Carver said. But that was not a human warrior. Not Darkspawn though. No, Commander. Carver folded his arms. Abomination of some kind would be my guest. He twitched a shoulder. Maybe something like that lady of the forest. Jiroth nodded. We may be on a false trail then. A powerful spirit, rather than a magister. What now? Carver frowned. Do we hunt it or is it even a threat? If it's not Darkspawn, it's not truly our problem, Jiroth replied. But if it's a threat, Morrigan is nearly finished with her work. I'll return with her. Stay a while longer, keep an eye on things. You may have been onto something with your theory that this thing stems from the same source as what we are hunting. I'd prefer to be sure. Yes, Commander. Despite Sirald technically being an Orlshian court, Carver was rather starting to enjoy it. The Marquis had stopped bothering with the guard after the incident with the Horned Knight. He had picked up on Carver's desire for discretion, and had arranged clothing more suitable for the Sirald court. Some sort of dance was held. He was rather impressed with the Marquis's ability to keep a straight face through the entire thing. It was early in the day when the Marquis entered his room with little more than a perfunctory nod. I need your help. Of course, Your Grace. That Horned Knight has taken Leon. Carver blinked. What? Why? The Marquis shook his head. Something about a song. With the Divine on her way, He sighed. The smart thing to do would be to leave him, but we'll get him back, Your Grace. Thank you. As much time as he'd spent in the deep roads and in the ways, finding a path through the maze was easy. The Marquis and his bodyguard kept pace, as did the small band that had joined them. Rather than risk too many secrets, the Marquis had left most of his guard behind. The woman who joined them was an outlaw, one who was apparently rather fond of the Marquis. It took Carver less than a heartbeat to realize the level of trust the Marquis was displaying by bringing both her and him along. Carver gestured, and they stepped around a corner. Leon's eyes widened when he saw them. Thank the Maker. I was starting to give up hope. They're not far, but they rely overmuch on this maze of theirs. Now get me out of here. They were most of the way back to where they had left the horses when cries went up behind them. The woman elbowed the silent bodyguard and looked from him to Carver. Get those idiots back safely. We'll lead them off. Will do, Carver said. The outlaw and her men rode off, and Carver heard them let out calls of their own. The Marquis mounted his horse, pulling the bard up behind him. The four of them rode carefully out of the woods. Carver didn't breathe freely until they were back across the stream and light again could reach the forest floor. He glanced over his shoulder to see Leon kissing the Marquis. For a moment, they reminded him of his brother and Fenris. Of course, if his brother had been involved, the forest would now probably be on fire. He caught the silent bodyguard's eye, and they shared a small smile of amusement. Leon told them what had happened as they approached the castle. You know what the so-called Lord of the Forest had me doing? Penning a ballad called The Shame of Siralt. He's obsessed with it. Both the event and the man. Thinks of nothing else. You still think this Horned Knight may be part of what brought you here in the first place? The Marquis leaned back in his chair. Carver nodded. It would not be the first time a risen corpse has been mistaken for Darkspawn, and if Leon is correct, it seems there are plenty of such things in the Horned Knight's court. Marquis Elrondil sighed. My father spent most of his life trying to undo his grandfather's shame. To be so close. He shook his head. We must do whatever we can to ensure the Divine's visit goes smoothly. Gifts, a feast, you'll come hunting with us, yes. Of course. He nodded. The Lord of Aliens is arriving on the morrow. Keep your head down, best if he doesn't realize you are none other than the Grey Warden Carver Hawk. He's been a good enough neighbor these last few years, but he would turn you over to the Divine in a heartbeat, and that would undoubtedly cause trouble for your brother. He elbowed Leon. And I'd be stuck with Renaud for sensible conversation. The silent bodyguard smiled. The Marquis knew enough of combat to get out of their way. Carver stood back to back with Renaud, and the assassins were dispatched quickly. Renaud checked them over, then shook his head. No sign of who hired them. Carver cleaned his blade, then sheathed it. Undoubtedly the same individual who poisoned the Dowager and tried framing. Does she actually have a name? At least a dozen, the Marquis said. Leon and I tend to just call her the dashing outlaw. It amuses her. He sighed. We'll need to head into the woods tomorrow. Have you hunted wyvern before? Actually, yes, Your Grace. The Marquis tilted his head. I heard the most interesting rumor about your brother and Duke Prosper. Are you quite sure you should be playing the bait? Leon asked the Marquis. You've got a point. Carver can play the bait, and I'll try stabbing the thing. I'm sure that will work out so much better for everyone. Leon narrowed his eyes at the Marquis. Befriending a warden has made you rather sarcastic. You could always play the bait, Carver said. The silent bodyguard shook his head, then mimed drinking from a bottle. Leon glared. Well, you don't have to shout. Now who is sarcastic? So now we know the Lord of Aliens was behind all this. We knew it the moment he arrived, the Marquis said. What we have now is proof. He's just going to deny it all. Leon sighed. He miscalculated, the Marquis said. He committed his crimes on Siralt soil, and here, I hold the right of high justice. We have proof enough that the Empress cannot condemn my actions, even if she weren't otherwise distracted. Throw him in the prison. Carver blinked, then smiled. You were playing him all along. He's been nipping at my borders for years. With the shame on my back, I won't win in any imperial court. I needed him overconfident. I do apologize for putting you in the middle. You didn't. He did. We've been invited to a feast at the Heartwood Court, by the Horned Knight. We. The creature interests you, does he not? The Marquis raised an eyebrow. You helped me rescue Leon, and we could not have slain the wyvern without your aid. If this helps you get the information you're after, it seems the least I can do. Carver smiled, then nodded. I appreciate it, Your Grace. And I admit, my interest is piqued as well. The Marquis smiled. We'll compare our findings later. After so many years as a warden, working with the commander and traveling through the ways, Carver had thought he'd seen just about everything. The Heartwood Court, however, was something else entirely. He wished he could have brought Meryl. She might have been able to make more sense out of the stories the Dryads told him. The Horned Knight himself had apparently been created by the Shame, the Marquis' ancestor. The lady, however, appeared to be a wholly different creature. She was a Sylvan, or so it seemed, and looked much like an elven maiden carved from wood, with blossoms growing here and there. He spoke to her, and she gave him a knowing smile. The roots of Siralt are old, warden, and deep. They were not pulled as happened in so many other places. He started to nod, then blinked. How did you know I was a warden? Her laughter was merry, water rushing over the rocks in a brook. Walk with me, warden. She led him to what had once been a chapel, sometime perhaps 1,000 years ago. She told him it was where the wolves came to pray. And others, once, long ago. You found traces of the forgotten, and they brought you here. Yes. What you seek is not here, not any longer. And that, I fear, is the true legacy of the Shame. Carver blinked. He freed it. I fear he did. And where has it gone since? She shook her head. I cannot say. But it is no longer here. One of them was here. Carver nodded. Up until about a century ago. The Shame of Siralt apparently released it, not realizing what it truly was. Jiroth growled in frustration. Then these rumors we are hearing out of Tevinter. It may not be Corypheus at all. He shook his head. Or more or luck, it may be, and we've also got whatever this thing was to deal with. How is Morrigan's project coming? She's done. We'll be leaving Siralt tomorrow. Stay a bit longer, see if you can find anything else. Just be sure you're well gone before the Divine arrives. Yes, Commander. My brother's friend, Prince Sebastian, once said that when times are good, a city can rule itself. The Marquis laughed. Well, no offense to your brother, but his friend was a buffoon. When times are good, people get notions that they can gain more for themselves, and pretty soon times are going bad again. Sebastian was something of an idealist, yes. Carver shrugged. Marquis Elrondil gazed down at his hand, then threw the cards on the table. There is another way we could learn more. Carver raised an eyebrow. Oh. The chantry has been sealed for 3 generations. Leon blinked. You are suggesting we break in? It's my chateau, it's not exactly breaking and entering. Oh, I'm sure the divine is going to be understanding. Leon set his own hand down. The Marquis shook his head. If my ancestor released something, it is my duty to see it put to rights. It's clean. Ah, excellent, Leon said. The Marquis sighed. He meant if it's been sealed, who cleaned it? Oh. Carver looked around at the imagery on the walls. He stopped at a painting of the archons. The face of one, he looked at it, then back at the Marquis, then back at the painting. You found something. The Marquis walked over. This archon looks a bit like you, or maybe like your ancestor. Oh, that would suit the man. Paint the archon Hessarian in his image. The Marquis gestured, tapping the face. The panel abruptly receded and slid open. They found themselves looking down a staircase, where a line of footsteps could clearly be seen in the dust. Oh. Carver found the Marquis standing at the window, staring out over the river. Elrondil glanced at him as he entered, then sighed. Protecting her may cost me, but she's family. Carver came to stand next to him. Trust me, I understand. I suppose you do. He sighed. She confirmed what the Dryad told you. The shame found something in the ruins. It convinced him that it would bring Cyrald glory, and he released it. It was the beginning of his madness. It spoke to him of shared blood, the Marquis said. He shook his head. A heavy thing. Descended not just from the shame, but from one of the very magisters that broke the world. It could have been lying. My life doesn't work that way. Carver sighed. Another feeling I know well. He squared his shoulders. The divine will be arriving soon. Which means you must be departing. I understand. He glanced down at the parchment in his hand, then offered it to the Marquis. This might help. What is it? Names. Cunary agents, in the court of the divine and in the Empress's court. Carver twitched a shoulder. A few other tidbits of information you might find useful. The Marquis's eyes widened. How did you come by this? Remember that rumor you heard about my brother and Duke Prosper? Carver shrugged. You should be able to gain some advantage from mentioning my presence as well. He laughed. Court is going to be a dull affair without you, my friend. He was nearly to the ruins and the doorway when he heard the Marquis's voice call his name. Carver turned. Your Grace. Surely you didn't intend to leave without saying goodbye. I was hoping to be gone without causing trouble for you, Carver replied. The Marquis waved a dismissive hand. I wouldn't know what to do if I didn't wake up to a dozen problems. Carver. He sighed. The divine will hear nothing of you from me, on that, you have my word. But don't argue. She'll know you were here, anything else would be foolish, but the only story she'll get is you showed up, helped us fight a Barriscarn, and vanished mysteriously. The Marquis smiled. You have a refuge here, my friend. I just wanted you to know that. Thank you. So does your sorceress friend, and her companion. Carver blinked. You. Good luck, Warden. And you, Marquis. Chapter 11, The Breach appears. Nathaniel crouched, and looked down over the trenches. He shook his head. I don't understand. It should be swarming with darkspawn. Anders frowned. The dwarves have retaken considerable territory. Which is why we should be encountering the spawn here. He cast out his senses. Stragglers, at least. The dwarves haven't claimed enough territory or fought enough spawn to account for this section of the deep roads to be empty. He stood, then glanced at his companion. What about the veil, any oddness? The glow came over Anders' eyes, and Justice replied. It is thin here. Many battles have occurred in the place. I sense no tears nearby. Any other suggestions? Merely an observation. Justice pointed. Lake Callanhood lies some miles that way. This would be the most direct path to that location. If Ezekiel is the architect's target, then there would be a horde here. Jiroth was sure they couldn't get to the one in the western approach. At least, not anytime in the next century. He frowned. Could they really be marching to Weishaupt? Unless he has given up on his intentions towards the archdemons. Let's head back to the surface. I hate entering the Fade down here. Justice tilted his head. You should not be able to enter the Fade at all. So everyone keeps telling us. Nathaniel shrugged as he began the path back the way they'd come. I don't suppose you have any notions there. If I knew once, it is knowledge lost to me. Had Anders carried a staff, they'd likely have been challenged. Danya, however, had managed to craft a sword that functioned much like a staff. Anders could use the blade as a focus, or as a sword. He was nowhere near the warrior Carver, Loghain, or Jiroth were, but with the three of them taking turns beating on him and the guidance of Justice, he was no longer embarrassing. Jiroth had been training the mage in an elven form of magic, and once Carinal had gotten over his shock at who and what Anders was, the young man had jumped at the chance to join in the training. They were nearly at their destination when the sky suddenly changed color. Something in the sky to the east shimmered, then a swirling vortex of green appeared. What the? Nathaniel asked. The blue light appeared in Anders' eyes. It's a veil tear, but on such a scale. He shook his head. It should not be possible. It's not possible. Move. We need to get to the others. Danya and Meryl sat next to a griffin, petting it and chatting, with Carver hovering nearby. Anders was pacing nervously, and it was clear Nathaniel was trying very hard not to do the same thing. He looked up when Morrigan and Jiroth entered. What's going on? Divine Justinia is dead. Jiroth didn't bother with any preamble. The Temple of Sacred Ashes was destroyed in whatever event created that breach. Maker's breath. There's more. Jiroth sighed. Some of you know already. Those we left behind at Vigil's Keep are gone. Official story is an earthquake. Based on my findings, someone blew the tunnel. Nathaniel shook his head. Who? Let me finish. Claral has recalled all the wardens to Orlais. Those remaining in the Vigil have already abandoned it to obey that order. Veril, Guravel, and Ser Alec have rallied, so Amaranthin, at least, is in no immediate danger. Thus ends the good news. Except for us. Jiroth folded his arms. Every warden in Orlais and Ferelden is hearing the calling. Carinal immediately started shaking his head. No. There is no way they could all be hearing the calling at once. You mentioned that the first warden accepted the mages with the intention of having them do research. On. Carinal blinked. On warden disappearances in the past. We hadn't really found anything, Valia said. Claral has made a contact in a Tevinter mage. They've been discussing blood magic. Does Loghain know what they are intending? Per the direct order of Claral, Loghain Mactier is a traitor to the wardens and to be apprehended at all costs. Carver blinked. Then why isn't he here? You can't have left him in Orlais with. He swallowed. Apologies, Commander. Vigilance is with him. He's leaving a false trail, then meeting up with your brother. Red lyrium was all over the remains of the Temple of Sacred Ashes. Jiroth sighed. There are already people in Haven working on the problem, including the right and left hands of Justinia, Kirkwall's former knight captain, and apparently Varric Tathras. A wonderful collection of people that will recognize us on sight. Carver sighed. And a competent collection, at least. Anders sighed. If Varric's there and involved, it won't be long before Hawk is as well. I'm counting on it, that's why I sent Loghain to him. Unlike the rest of us, Loghain's been a good little warden for the past decade. Leliana won't be happy about his presence, but she'll accept it. He glanced over his shoulder at Morrigan. Morrigan will stick with Empress Selene for now. As for the rest of us. He shook his head. Carinal, your crew stays with the Griffins. Your job is to keep them safe. Worst comes to worst, you've got the caches. You'll be able to rebuild. You can't think it's going to get that bad. Carinal's eyes were wide. 2 days ago I wouldn't have thought someone could kick a hole in the sky. Fair point. As for the rest of us, Jiroth shook his head. The wardens have abandoned their posts, and there are still darkspawn to be dealt with. We've got to pick up the slack, or this Inquisition won't stand a chance. He considered a moment. They've got a hell of a problem on their hands, and if they are going to solve it, they need the best. He looked over at Danya. And that's you. She blinked. Me. Officially, you've no ties to us. Put out word that you're interested in lending your skills to the Inquisition. Leliana will jump at the bait. We won't be able to contact you while you are there, but Loghain is on his way. He smiled at her. You're the best at what you do, Danya. Then I'll do my best. Jiroth turned his gaze to first Carver, then to Temarin, Nathaniel, and Anders. Wardens, we've got a job to do. Let's move. Check the description for the links to the author.